Hi, welcome to Vortex Media's Mastering the Sony HVR-Z7U training workshop. My name is Doug Jensen, and over the next few hours we're going to be taking a detailed look at this amazing camera and its revolutionary new features. There's no denying that the Z7 and its shoulder mount brother, the S270, provide an impressive evolution from the Z1U camcorder that was first introduced back in 2005 when HDV was still in its infancy. Now basically what Sony has done with the Z7 and S270 is kept the best things about the Z1, which I still think is a great camera, and then added features like interchangeable lenses, tapeless recording on removable memory cards, native progressive shooting modes, much better light sensitivity, and a whole bunch of other improvements that we'll be taking a closer look at over the course of this workshop. Now, because you've probably already bought one of these cameras, I'm going to skip the sales pitch and instead concentrate just on showing you what you need to know to get the most out of your new camera. During this video, I'm going to be focusing exclusively on the Z7 instead of going back and forth between it and the S270. But it doesn't matter which camera you own, because if you understand one of them, then you understand them both. The S270 has a shoulder mount design, it accepts longer length tapes, it has HD SDI output instead of HDMI, it uses different batteries, it offers 4 channels of audio, and the external controls are located differently on the body. But other than that, the cameras are essentially the same. So whether you own an S270 or a Z7, you're going to learn a lot from this DVD. I'm sure I don't need to point out that the Z7 and the S270 are very sophisticated and somewhat complicated camcorders with a steep learning curve if you really want to take advantage of all the features they offer. So the goal of this workshop is to help flatten that learning curve and save you a lot of time mastering your new camera. On a technical note, all of the footage seen in this DVD was shot with this Z7, unless you see the Z7 in the shot, such as here in the studio. I've only got one Z7, so whenever you see it in the frame, you'll know that that particular footage was shot with my XDCam HD f350 camera. Now, although I'm occasionally hired by Sony to shoot test footage with new cameras and teach seminars, I'm not employed by Sony, and Sony has had no input or participation in the production of this video. So there's really no reason why I won't hesitate to tell you exactly what I really think. The Z7 and the S270 are excellent cameras, but they have some things about them that aren't so great, and I'll be talking about those too. Now, if you've seen any of my other training DVDs, some footage might look a little familiar to you, but that's only because I often go back to the same locations whenever I need to test a camera or shoot sample footage. So let me assure you that everything you'll see today, unless otherwise identified, is new footage shot with the Z7 just for this workshop. Now, as we go along through this workshop, you might decide to reject some of the things I'm going to tell you, either because your needs are different or you'll simply disagree with my opinions. And that's fine. I urge you to think for yourself. Look at this video as a starting point, a booster to help get you up and running as quickly as possible with the camera. But it's not the final word. There are as many different ways of using the Z7 as there are Z7 owners. Now, I suggest that you have a pen and paper ready to take notes and that you make plans to watch this video again in a month or two. You might pick up some things on a second viewing that you missed the first time through. So let's get started, because we've got an awful lot of ground to cover. The best place to start our workshop is to take a quick tour around the camera to get familiar with the external buttons and controls. And then we'll take a closer look at most of them in later chapters of the DVD. You know, the layout is really well thought out. Sony has obviously taken the feedback they got from owners of their earlier HDV cameras and used that information to come up with a camera that better suits the needs of experienced professionals. Time wasted scrolling through menus is minimized because the most commonly used functions can be readily accessed via the numerous buttons and controls found mostly on the top and on the left side of the camera, where you can easily see them. There are really no important controls on the rear or the right side, and that's the way a professional camera should be designed. As you'd expect, the Z7 comes with a very nice flip-out LCD monitor. Not only does it have 4 times the number of pixels that the Z1's LCD has, it also provides 100% coverage so that you can see the entire image that's being recorded. There's almost no limit to the different combinations of markers and data displays that can be shown on the monitor and in the viewfinder. All you have to do is choose the ones you want from the corresponding menu page. I suggest you think about getting Sony's optional LCD hood. because it sure makes the monitor easier to read outdoors. It just slides right on like this, and then when you're done, just fold it up, put it away like that. In my opinion, this convenient little accessory is well worth the money. The default setting for the Z7 is to automatically turn off power to the viewfinder whenever the LCD monitor is open. Now this can save a little battery power, but I suggest changing the menu setting to allow simultaneous operation of both the viewfinder and the LCD monitor. That way you'll be able to switch back and forth between the two of them at any time. You might want to use the viewfinder for critical focus or handheld shooting, but use the LCD most of the time simply because it's more comfortable and easier to use. If you want to, you can turn off the color in the viewfinder to make it black and white instead. Does it make a difference in sharpness or help with focusing? Well, that's for you to decide, but I usually leave the color turned on. And don't forget to take a few seconds to adjust the focus of the eyepiece with this slider control so that the diopter matches your own eyesight. Underneath where the monitor is stowed, you'll find quite a few buttons and switches for tape transport, headphone volume, timecode display, and more. It's mostly pretty standard stuff that you've seen plenty of times before on other cameras. We'll cover these controls as necessary during the DVD, so for now, let's move along. On the front end of the camera, Sony has chosen to include an excellent Carl Zeiss lens. It's a full-featured professional lens with 3 independent rings for focus, zoom, and aperture. The focus ring is big, easy to grip, and surprisingly precise. And of course, the Z7 also has several different autofocus modes if you prefer. Besides a familiar variable speed rocker switch on the grip, which is a little slow, there's another zoom control on top of the handle. And you can even connect an optional external length zoom control. And if none of that suits you, you can still always zoom manually simply by turning the zoom ring on the lens. Unlike the Z1, even snap zooms are possible with the Z7. The iris can be set to automatic with this switch on the lens, or it can be controlled manually. The lens has a normal looking iris ring right on the barrel, right where you'd expect it to be, instead of the awkward silver knob that the Z1 uses. My only 2 complaints about the iris ring are that there are no markings to show the f-stops on the lens, and the ring rotates endlessly with no hard stops at the minimum and maximum apertures, but you get used to it pretty quickly. Another huge improvement over the Z1 is that the aperture can be adjusted up and down seamlessly without any of the stepping effects that make it impossible to adjust the iris live in the middle of a shot with the Z1. The importance of this one improvement should not be overlooked. When zoomed out fully wide, the maximum aperture is f1.6, which makes it great for low light shooting. As you zoom in, be aware that the maximum aperture is gradually reduced to f2, but you'll hardly notice the change in most shooting situations. And there's almost no darkening around the edges like you'd see with lesser quality lenses. The focal length of the 12x zoom ranges from 4.4mm to 52.8mm. Not great, but certainly adequate. The lens accepts regular 72mm photographic filters available at any camera store, and I suggest that you use either a UV haze filter or a clear glass filter at all times to protect the front element of the lens. A big feature of the Z7, and maybe one of the reasons you bought it, is that the stock lens can be removed and replaced with another lens. Here you see the camera being used with a very nice Fujinon 13 by 3.5 wide-angle lens. We'll talk quite a bit more about lens choices in a later chapter. Throughout the rest of this DVD, unless I say otherwise, I'll be using the stock Zeiss lens. So some of the features and functions that I'll talk about may or may not apply if you have a different lens mounted on the camera. As I said earlier, on the left side of the camera, you'll find the majority of the Z7's external controls. Making changes to the camera settings by turning a dial, pushing a button, or sliding a switch is a lot faster and more convenient than digging through the menus. Everything from white balance to audio levels to exposure settings are controlled right here. Let's begin at the top with the power switch. This should be self-explanatory. Slide it to the left for shooting, slide it to the right for playback functions, or put it in the middle to turn the camera off. Next to that, you'll find a neutral density filter wheel with 4 settings. These are real optical filters and not just a gimmick to electronically change the gain. Unlike other cameras you may have used in the past, the ND filters have nothing at all to do with white balance. They are strictly neutral density filters for reducing the amount of light coming into the camera, and can therefore be used indoors or outdoors. We'll be talking a lot more about how to set exposure in a later chapter. Below the filter wheel, you'll see a row of 3 buttons labeled 4, 5, and 6. These are assign buttons, and there are 3 more assign buttons nearby labeled 1, 2, and 3. Assign buttons are a standard Sony camcorder feature that have been around for several years now, so you probably already know what their purpose is, but let me explain anyway, just in case. Basically, you can customize each of these 6 buttons to quickly access any of 28 frequently used controls. That way you can easily turn on or off certain settings at the touch of a button without having to dig down through layers of menus every time. More than 24 different functions such as hypergain, peaking, color bars, and steady shot are assignable to any of the 6 buttons. And if 6 buttons aren't enough, there are 2 more assigned buttons located on the lens, labeled L1 and L2. Assigned buttons number 4, number 5, and number 6 are labeled with their default settings, but each of them can easily be reprogrammed for something else instead. Buttons 1, 2, and 3 have no function at all unless you assign them something with the menus. There's a whole chapter later in the workshop about what you can do with the assigned buttons. Underneath this protective cover, you'll find some controls for setting the audio levels. You can choose automatic or manual control, and you can increase or decrease the volume with the rotary knobs. Notice that each channel can be set independently. We'll talk more about these and the rest of the audio controls in the audio chapter. Next, there are 3 buttons in this area of the camcorder that can be used to turn on or off manual control of gain, white balance, and shutter speed. But these buttons only become active when the auto manual switch has been set to the manual position. This point is very important, so let me repeat it. If this switch is in the auto position, then all 3 of these buttons are completely disabled. They don't work, they have no function. But that's not all. These other 2 switches down below, that we'll talk about in a minute, are also disabled, and so is the aperture ring on the lens, and so is the auto exposure switch on the lens grip. So just about any function on the camera that has anything to do with exposure or white balance is disabled when you put this switch in the auto position. Now obviously, to an experienced professional, full auto is not a good idea, unless you're in such a hurry that you have no other choice. I suggest that you slide it over to the manual position right now and don't ever change it. Just ignore the switch and pretend it doesn't even exist. Now let's go back to these 3 buttons and take a closer look at what they do. These are basically just on-off switches for manual control of gain, white balance, and shutter speed. For example, if I press this button, then I can toggle back and forth between automatic and manual control of the camera's gain setting. It's too bad there isn't an indicator light next to the gain button to tell you when it's turned on. The only way to know if you're in manual or automatic mode is to look at the display on the monitor or viewfinder. If you see an A icon next to the gain value, then the camera is on automatic gain control mode, and the camera will decide all on its own what gain setting to use. To switch to the manual mode, you press the gain button and the A goes away. If there's no A icon shown, then the camera is in manual gain control mode. Now to actually set the value of the camera's gain setting, you use this switch to choose one of the 3 preset gain levels. The default values are 0 dB for L, 9 dB for M, and 18 dB for H. The larger the number, the more sensitive the camera is to light, but that comes at the expense of picture quality. We'll talk more about setting the gain and customizing the values of the 3 positions of this switch later in the DVD. Now that you've seen how to toggle the camera between automatic and manual gain control, it should be pretty clear how to do the same thing for white balance. You could use the white balance button to toggle back and forth between automatic and manual control. If white balance is in the manual mode, then this 3-position switch is what determines the camera's current white balance setting. There's preset, memory A, and memory B. But once again, there's no indicator light next to the white balance button to tell you what mode you're in. So how do you know if you're in manual or automatic control? Well, the only way to know for sure is to look at the display. If you're in manual mode, then you'll see an icon in the corner. If you do not see an icon, then you must be in automatic mode. Not surprisingly, the shutter speed button works the same way as the gain button. If you see an A icon next to the shutter speed, then the camera is setting the shutter speed automatically. But if there's no icon, then it's in manual mode. To change the shutter speed, press the shutter speed button and the camera's current shutter speed will be highlighted in a gray box. The gray box means that you can now change the value. You do that by rotating the select button either direction to choose a different speed. When you find the speed you want, you press in on the select button to lock it in. We'll talk more about all three of these buttons in later chapters, and I'll explain why I think you should never run the camera with automatic mode for gain, white balance, shutter speed, or iris turned on. If you want to shoot great video, it's imperative that you understand how to control all of these settings manually. This isn't a consumer camcorder, so don't treat it like one. Moving towards the rear of the camera, we find the menu button, which is used to access the camera's menu system. The entire menu system is easy to understand, and I'm sure that you'll have no trouble getting comfortable with it. The select button, as we just saw, is used to scroll through the camera settings and make changes. You spin it to highlight the setting you want, and then make a selection by pressing in on it. Next, there's the picture profile button, which is used to create, store, and recall up to 6 different sets of customized camera paint settings. Each of the 6 memory banks can store a number of custom picture settings such as black level, gamma, detail, and knee to suit various shooting conditions and styles. For example, suppose there's a certain set of camera settings that you like to use whenever you're shooting indoor interviews and a different look for shooting outdoor sports. Well, instead of going through all the camera menus and changing them one by one every time you want to switch from one look to the other, you can store up to 6 different picture profiles on board the camera and then recall them at any time with the press of a button. Picture profiles can even be moved from one camera to another by using a memory stick. Next, there's the status check button, which makes it very easy to display up to 8 different pages of information about the camera's current settings without drilling down into each individual menu. The status check button is a big time saver, and it's something you should get in the habit of using often. Page 1 shows the status of the current audio settings. You've got VU meters that are several times bigger than the tiny VU meters that are normally displayed on the screen, plus information about a few other audio settings that we'll talk about later. To go to page 2 of the status displays, you just spin the select button. Now we can see some of the camera's current output settings. Page 3 shows the output settings for the iLink or FireWire port. Page 4 shows the functions that have been programmed into 6 of the assigned buttons. If you're following along with your own camera, you may notice that the settings on my camera are no longer on the default settings. Page 5 shows the functions of the other assigned buttons located on the lens. L1 and L2 only work with the Zeiss lenses, and return only functions if you have some other brand of lens mounted on the camera. Page 6 shows several other menu settings including gain and white balance. Page 7 shows even more white balance and gain settings, plus some settings for auto iris. And finally, page 8 will only be shown if you have the memory recording unit attached to the camera. If it is attached and turned on, then you'll see this page. Otherwise, there will only be 7 status pages available. The memory recording unit, or MRU as I'll be calling it during the rest of this workshop, is one of the best things about the Z7 because it offers the option of recording HDV, DV-CAM, or DV to a standard compact flash memory card, while simultaneously recording to tape. The MRU attaches directly to the camera and thus eliminates the need for any cables or extra batteries of its own. Plus, the unit automatically synchronizes with the recording action of the camcorder, so you can just turn it on and pretty much forget about it until you're done shooting. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that the MRU is as sophisticated or as easy to use as the S/S memory card recording system found on the EX1, because it's not. But it's not too bad. And when you factor in the ability to record simultaneously to videotape and the much lower cost of the compact flash memory cards, well, then the Z7 has no rivals. For the time being, I'm going to just ignore the MRU and save it for later because I don't want to get sidetracked talking about it until you're really up to speed on the rest of the camera. So I'm going to remove the MRU and set it aside. If you want to learn about the MRU right away, I suggest you jump ahead to Chapter 18. So with the MRU removed and all of its options and workflow issues ignored for the moment, the Z7 really isn't much different than any other Sony HDV camcorder. The Z7 even uses the same batteries as the Z1 and FX1. As you can see, the recessed battery compartment is large enough to accommodate even the optional high-capacity NP F970 battery, which provides about 5 hours of operating time. That's impressive. To remove the battery, you just press down on the battery release switch, slide the battery up, and pull it out. Also on the rear of the camera, you'll find a half dozen ports for connecting the Z7 to many other devices. First, there's the HDMI connector for monitoring the Z7 on a video monitor. On the S270, there's an HD SDI connector instead. Next, there's the Firewire, or iLink connector as Sony calls it. Your video footage can be logged and captured with your NLE via the Firewire connector, exactly like any other camcorder or deck that you've used in the past. The camera can even downconvert HDV to DV during the transfer. The Firewire connector can also be used for dubbing to or from other devices. Depending on the deck at the other end, you can send and receive HDV or DV signals, which makes the Z7 a very versatile piece of equipment to own. There's also a component connector for outputting either an HD or SD video signal with the supplied cable. And naturally, there's an AV connector for outputting a standard definition composite video signal and both channels of audio to a standard definition TV monitor with the supplied cable. Now, in case it hasn't occurred to you, let me point out that the component connector does not have any audio associated with it. So if you want to hear any sound while you're watching the component signal, then you'll also need to use the AV cable at the same time. Next, there's a link connector for attaching compatible accessories such as a remote zoom controller for the lens. And below that, there's a standard headphone jack for audio monitoring. Volume is controlled with the button on the top of the camera. The final feature on the rear of the camera is the cassette compartment and the eject button. I'm certain that you already know how this works, so I won't waste any time on it. Over here, we find a slot for a memory stick duo card. Just open the door, slide the card in. But what is it for, you ask? Two things. Number one, it's used for capturing still photographs just like you do with a digital camera. We'll talk more about that feature in a later chapter. The second use of the memory stick is to store camera profiles. A camera profile is kind of like a preference file for your camcorder because it stores all of your customized menu settings so they can be recalled at any time or shared with the other cameras. We'll talk about camera profiles later. Next, we have the lens grip. There's an ordinary record start-stop button for your thumb, a variable speed zoom rocker switch, and a feature called expanded focus. Expanded focus is a digital zoom that electronically magnifies the image to about 1.5 times the normal size, so you can more easily check your focus. Unfortunately, this feature only works when the camera is in standby, so you can't check your focus on the fly while you're rolling. Over here, there are a couple of controls for auto iris. These are a welcome change from the quirky way that the Z1 controlled the aperture. If your background comes from shooting with a Betacam or other professional camcorder that had a removable lens, then these controls should look quite familiar. We'll talk more about them in the exposure chapter. To remove a lens from the camera, you flip this locking switch up here, and then turn the silver ring until the lens comes loose, and then pull it off. Notice that removing the lens reveals a cover that hides a multi-pin port that's used for connecting other lenses. If you have a lens with a cable attached to it, you'll need to connect it to the camera here, or you won't have any servo zoom control or auto iris. Above the lens, there's a pretty decent shotgun microphone, and just below that, there's two XLR audio connectors. Around the corner, there are two audio input switches that need to be set to match whatever type of audio source is being input on the XLRs. Each input is controlled independently. The choices are line level, mic level, or mic level with 48-volt phantom power. Phantom power is a means of powering certain types of microphones from the camera instead of from the microphone's own internal batteries. The mic that comes with the Z7 does require phantom power, so make sure the switch for that input is in the lower position. There's also a third switch that lets you route the input on XLR number 1 to both channels 1 and 2. We'll talk more about that later. Up front, there's a sensor for the infrared remote control and a tally light. There's also another tally light and another infrared sensor located at the rear just under the viewfinder. They can all be disabled anytime you want by simply changing their menu settings. The Z7 features two accessory shoes. First, there's a cold shoe on the front that can be removed to make room for a mat box. While at the rear, there's a threaded hole on the handle for mounting screw-in accessories, or it can be changed using the supplied parts into a second cold shoe for mounting other types of accessories. Also on the handle is another zoom control that works in conjunction with a programmable switch along the side to control the speed. And unlike the zoom control on the handles of the Z1 and the EX1, this zoom control has a pressure-sensitive variable speed option, so you'll be able to perform professional-looking zooms with nice, smooth starts and stops. Next, there's another record start-stop button that can be locked on or off. Under the handle, you'll find the 3 shot transition buttons that can be used to execute smooth automatic transitions between 2 different shots that you've programmed into the A and B memories. Now, if you don't need that function, you can use the A and B buttons for focus marking instead. This is a clever new feature not found on any of Sony's previous HDV cameras, and we'll take a closer look at it in the focus chapter. The final area of the camera we need to examine is the upper control panel. Most of these buttons are well labeled and should look familiar to anyone who's used this type of camcorder before. This area is used exclusively for VCR control of the videotape, and the buttons have no function at all during shooting. They only become active when the power switch is in the VCR position. The same thing goes for this section. These 3 buttons don't do anything unless you're in the VCR mode, but when you are in VCR mode, they allow you to view any digital photos you've recorded on the memory stick. You could just think of them as the photo playback buttons. We'll see how they work later, but if you're not planning on taking digital photos with the Z7, then you can simply ignore these buttons. The data code button also only works in the VCR mode, and more specifically, only when you're playing back footage. The button toggles the on-screen display between showing the date and time that the video was shot, or the camera data display, or nothing at all. Let's go back to camera data display. Basically, this is just metadata that the camera captured while you were shooting. You can see whether steady shot was turned on or off. You can tell if the exposure was being set manually or automatically, the iris setting, the gain value, the shutter speed, and the white balance mode. Now let's slide the power switch back to the camera mode. The volume button controls the headphones output, but it has no effect on the sound that's being recorded. The timecode user bits button toggles the on-screen display between timecode and user bits. The display battery info button toggles the on-screen display between the detail display, the simple display, and no display at all as you press the button. Normally, you'll want to keep the detail display turned on so you can monitor the camera's settings during shooting, but occasionally you might prefer not to have them cluttering up the screen. We've got the estimated remaining battery life, the zoom setting, displayed either as an indicator bar or as a number, depending on the choice you've made with the menu setting. Here we can see that the lens is zoomed in 50%. The current recording format, we're shooting HDV instead of DV or DV cam. The scan type, here we see the camera is set to record 30 frames per second progressive. An electronic bubble to let you know if the camera is level or not. This is especially useful during handheld shooting. My old Ikegami Betacam had this feature many years ago, and I've missed it on the newer cameras. There are icons for zebra and peaking if either of those is turned on. The current distance the lens is focused at. The aperture of the lens. Which picture profile is being used, if any. An icon if steady shot is turned off. If steady shot is turned on, there's no indicator. The gain setting. The shutter speed. The white balance mode, audio meters for both channels 1 and 2. I can tell by this icon that channel 2 is set for manual gain control, and the lack of an icon for channel 1 tells me that it must be set for automatic gain control. I've got the center marker turned on, and there are also options for customizable safety zone markers, aspect markers, and even a guide frame grid to assist with composition. There's an indicator that shows about how much time is left on the tape, and finally, the timecode display. This may seem like a lot of information, but as you saw earlier, there's a lot more that could be displayed if you wanted to go into the display set menu and change a few settings. Or, going to the other extreme, if you don't want any of this information displayed, you can always hide it all by pressing the display button. Another use of the display button is to check the remaining battery charge without turning the camera on. If you press and hold the battery info button briefly while the camera is turned off, the status of the battery will be displayed for a few seconds. Now, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on how you like to shoot, the Z7 is not designed to rest on your shoulder, and that's one of the big differences with the S270. Holding the Z7 out in front can seem awkward, and it takes some getting used to. So, if you expect to be doing a lot of handheld shooting, I recommend you consider getting a shoulder brace. This shoulder brace was designed specifically with the Z7 and the EX1 in mind. Here we see it being used with an EX1, but it also works exactly the same with the Z7. Unlike other braces that have awkward pistol grips, unnecessary supports underneath that connect to your belt or other gimmicks, the sole purpose of the VSB1 is to turn the EX1 and the Z7 into traditional shoulder-mounted camcorders. Your right hand goes on the camera grip, the body rests on your shoulder, the viewfinder is situated directly in front of your right eye, where it should be, and your left hand is free to rack focus, adjust the iris, or steady the camera. The box on the back allows you to hang wireless microphone receivers, counterweights to balance the camera on your shoulder, or an external battery. To further help with stability, the Z7 has a built-in optical stabilization system called Steady Shot, and it really does work. You can program any of the 8 assign buttons for Steady Shot. So that does it. That concludes our overview of the camera, and you should now have a pretty good understanding of the major features of the Z7, plus a general sense of where the important buttons and controls are located. But I haven't given you much detail. That's what's coming up in the next chapters. As with any professional camera these days, the menu system is the heart, soul, and brains of the unit. Without a good understanding of how to use the menus and what changes can be made with them, you'll never feel at home with the camera or maximize its potential. In fact, there are so many different ways to customize the Z7 and the S270 that it might seem overwhelming at first, but in reality, it's actually a great thing to have so much control. Now, some of the menu choices you select will have huge impacts on the look, style, and quality of the video you shoot. Some choices will affect your workflow later on down the line, and other choices won't make much of a difference to the recorded image or the workflow, but they will make your life easier during the shoot. Anytime you press the menu button, this is the screen you'll always see first. Unfortunately, the Z7 does not return to the last menu that you were using like some cameras do. It always starts here at the top level. Running down the left side, you'll see the 7 main menus: camera set, audio set, display set, in-out record, timecode user bits set, memory set, and others for everything else. Every menu on the Z7 is a submenu of one of these 7 setup menus. There are 33 submenus under camera set, but you'd have to select it and scroll down to see them all. At first it appears that there are only 3 submenus under audio set, but if you select XLR set, there's another 8 in the next level. There are 20 submenus under display set, 8 under in-out record, 9 under timecode user bits set, 4 under memory set, and 12 under others. Now by my count, that's nearly 100 submenus, and each of them has at least 2 and sometimes several different settings to choose from. So with this many options, the menu system can seem overwhelming at first, but with a little experience, you'll get the hang of navigating through it quickly and efficiently. Now, the purpose of this video is not to go through every menu and describe the hundreds of changes that can be made. The most important menus will be covered elsewhere on this DVD, and the rest of them, I would say, are either self-explanatory or should be changed by advanced users only. A good rule of thumb to keep in mind as you look through the menus is this: if you don't know what the setting does, don't change it, because a change to one menu may have unintended side effects with other settings or controls on the camera, and suddenly things won't be working right and you won't know why. However, that doesn't mean you shouldn't feel free to experiment. All I'm saying is that you need to keep track of the changes you make and be ready to undo them if necessary. However, if all else fails and you've really messed things up, you can poke a paperclip into the hole right here to reset just about every setting on the camera back to the factory defaults. Then you can start over again from scratch. Or even better, you can save your camera's current settings as a camera profile before you start experimenting, and then you can recall that profile anytime you want to go back. Now, one difference you may notice if you've worked with a Z1 in the past is that there is no longer a personal menu for consolidating your most frequently used menus into one easy-to-use location. For better or worse, that feature has been eliminated. To exit the menus at any time, just press the menu button. Like other cameras in Sony's HDV and XDCam product lines, the Z7 offers quite a few options for recording modes. The format you choose to shoot on is entirely up to you and might even change from day to day depending on your particular needs at the moment. The Z7 and S270 can be switched between HDV, DV cam, and DV recording modes, thus providing full flexibility to shoot either standard definition or high definition. But don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with a lecture about bit rates, codecs, compression, or other jargon. There are plenty of other sources out there if you want to look under the hood of your camera. For the most part, we can just ignore the technology inside the camera because to shoot with it, we really just need to know which format is the best one to use at any given time, and then how to select it. The Z7 and S270 offer several advanced shooting modes not found on earlier cameras like the Z1, but they don't offer any PAL modes. The Z7U and the S270U only do NTSC. On the other hand, if you live in Europe, then your camera only does PAL. In the interest of time, I'm going to ignore the PAL modes during this presentation because the technical differences between PAL and NTSC are just a minor issue as far as we're concerned here. If you're watching this DVD in a PAL country, I apologize for not addressing PAL directly, but I have full confidence that you'll be able to translate the NTSC information I'm going to give into the PAL equivalents. So, with the Z7U, these are your 12 basic choices. But if you want to get technical about it, here's really the full list of choices because all the standard definition formats offer both 4x3 and 16:9 widescreen options. Now that's really a lot of options to pick from, especially if you're moving up from a Betacam or a DV cam or some other camcorder where there was usually only one or two choices. So how do you go about picking the right format to use? Well, really it's just a simple process of elimination until you're left with the one mode that suits your needs the best. There are many factors that might influence your format decision. Maybe you already have an existing workflow that you need to stay compatible with, or maybe there are certain limitations with your NLE software that need to be taken into consideration, or maybe you'll be using other cameras within the production that don't have all the choices that the Z7 offers. The point I'm making is that there are a lot of factors to consider when choosing the right format to use, and I can't even warn you what they all are, let alone tell you definitively which format you should shoot with. It is very important that you choose your recording mode wisely at the start of a new project, because that is the only way that you can be assured that the rest of your workflow will go smoothly. However, for the time being, let's assume that we have full freedom to choose any recording mode that we want to use. It's completely up to us, so let's narrow down the choices and pick one via the process of elimination. But first, let me warn you about recording DV and HDV on the same tape, or different frame rates on the same tape. Either of those situations can cause problems during capture and playback. That's one of the advantages of recording on compact flash cards, because changing formats anytime you want is no problem at all. Now, I think we can agree that the first choice that needs to be made is whether to shoot in standard definition or high definition. I mean, that's a major decision that will have ramifications throughout your entire workflow. Not just right now, but also years down the line if you ever want to use this footage ever again. In my opinion, you should be shooting in high definition 100% of the time. But I understand there are some situations where that isn't feasible, and that's fine. Go ahead and shoot in SD if you need to. But in general, I'm going to suggest that you should be shooting HD 100% of the time. Why? Well, why not? There are no disadvantages to recording your raw footage in HDV right now. Even if you'll be editing in SD, you should be shooting in HD so you future-proof your raw footage. In my opinion, your decision as to whether or not to shoot in HD ought to be made entirely separately and independently from how you will be delivering the project that you're working on. So let's start narrowing down the 12 choices. 6 of them are SD and 6 are HD. Let's talk about the two SD formats first. What's the difference between DV and DV cam? Not a lot. They basically use the same video and audio encoding format, but they have minor differences in speed and track pitch. The consumer-oriented DV allows over 60 minutes of recording per tape and will play back in almost any DV player. On the other hand, with DV cam, you only get 40 minutes per tape and you'll need a DV cam compatible player. But the trade-off is that you'll have less risk of dropouts and other video problems. If you're going to shoot your raw footage in standard definition, then DV cam is the superior choice. Whether you choose 16:9 or 4:3 is also a decision that you'll have to make. But as I said already, unless you have a good reason for shooting SD, you'll want to choose one of the HDV modes. So we can cut the choices in half by eliminating all 6 of the DV and DV cam options. That still leaves us with 6 modes to choose from. What's the difference among them? I'd say the main difference is interlaced versus progressive. Your decision between 6DI or one of the 5 progressive modes is mostly just a subjective decision. Now, opinions vary widely as to which type of recording mode looks better, And I don't want to get sidetracked into that debate or try to explain the technical differences between progressive and interlaced video, because the differences are mostly just a matter of personal preference. But for many people, myself included, one of the very best things about the Z7 is the ability to shoot in a true progressive mode, which gives the video that highly sought after film look. For comparison of what they look like, here are some examples of video that was shot at 30p and at 60i. Keep in mind that since I'm editing this DVD with progressive settings, the interlaced footage won't look like pure interlaced anymore. You should do some comparisons with your own camera to really get the feel of how the two scan types compare. Now, which looks better to you? Personally, I don't care for the look of interlaced video at all. To me, interlaced looks like standard definition live sports, local television news, or home videos. Interlaced is not the look I want for my productions, and I never shoot interlaced. On the other hand, progressive mimics the look and feel of a program having been shot on film, and making video look more like film has been a goal of videographers for decades. Now, there are many factors that go into making video look more like film, but selecting the progressive frame mode is a great place to start. So if you're like me and prefer the look of progressive video, let's eliminate the 60i mode from the list. That leaves us with these 5 choices. Now, the next 3 on the list, 24p scan, 24p scan A, and 30p scan, all sound like they ought to be progressive, but they aren't really. They're what I would call pseudo-progressive because technically the video signal being recorded is still 60i, not true progressive. For example, in the 24p scan mode, the camera is really recording 30 interlaced frames a second to tape, and those extra 6 frames are going to have to be extracted later by your NLE to get the 24p look that you desire. That's called pull down. Same goes for the 24p scan A mode. The only difference is that this mode flags certain frames so the frame extraction is handled differently. And even the 30p scan mode still records 2 interlaced fields per second. There's just some trickery to make it look progressive. So none of the 3 scan modes is the best option if you really want to get a true progressive look. I think that Sony created these modes as a stopgap measure to try and meet the demands of customers who wanted the look of progressive video before HDV could really do it right. And I have to admit that it didn't look too bad for what it was. But times have changed. Technology has marched on, and true progressive shooting on HDV is here. So why would you want to use fake progressive when the Z7 and the S270 offer true progressive modes? Well, I'll tell you why you might not want to use the native progressive modes, for the same reasons I talked about before. Your current workflow and/or existing VCRs and other HDV camcorders might not be able to handle true progressive footage. Only the latest models of Sony's HDV VCRs, such as the M35U, can play back the progressive footage. So you'll need to stop and think about your whole workflow before you go off in the wrong direction. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Test your whole workflow before embarking on an important project. The scan modes should be selected when a progressive look is desired on 60i material, but you need maximum compatibility. Recordings made in the scan modes can be played back, captured, and edited as typical 60i material. And I should point out that both of the SD shooting modes, that's DV and DV Cam, also offer 24p scan and 30p scan. So even if you decide to shoot in standard definition, you can still get a pretty decent progressive look for your footage. As we established earlier, we're assuming that in our workshop here today, we have the freedom to choose any recording mode we want. So let's eliminate the 3 scan modes. And that leaves us with 2 remaining choices, 24p or 30p. Both of them are true progressive HD formats that look great. Most of the footage you see on this DVD was shot with these 2 modes. Here are some scenes that I shot at 30p and at 24p. Keep in mind that the DVD you're watching was edited with 30p settings, so the 24p footage won't look like pure 24p footage anymore. You should do some testing with your own camera to get a true feel of how 24p and 30p compare. Which of these 2 modes looks better to you? Again, it's a matter of personal preference. Some people swear by 24p and others prefer 30p. Personally, I choose the 30p mode for most of my work. Now, if you're shooting an independent film that will actually be output to film, then that might be a good reason to shoot 24p. But I don't think very many of us will ever transfer our work to film. Most people's work will either be broadcast on television or released on DVD, and both of those display at 30 frames per second. So if you shoot 24p, those missing 6 frames per second are going to have to come from somewhere, and I'd prefer to capture them when I shoot rather than having them interpolated from the other frames in post. The only other reason I can think of to shoot 24p is if your video will be shown exclusively on the web. All other things being equal, 24 frames per second requires 20% less bandwidth than 30 frames per second. So for me, HDV 30p is my usual choice for the video format setting. But what looks better to you? What fits in better with the project you're shooting? Let the answers to those questions be your guide. The Z7 and the S270 give you the choice of fully automatic exposure, fully manual exposure, or several variations in between. In the fully automatic exposure mode, you basically just slide the auto-manual switch to auto and start shooting. The ND filter is the only manual exposure control available to you in the automatic mode, and the camera will make all of the exposure decisions for you by setting the aperture, gain, and shutter speed according to its own internal programming. Now that's one way of doing it, but a better way is to maintain control of your exposure manually and not let the camera make those decisions for you. In order to get good results with the Z7 or the S270, you need to understand how exposure works and how to control it manually. For the rest of this DVD, and really for as long as I own my Z7, this switch will always be in the manual position, and I suggest that you do the same. In fact, I'm barely going to cover any of the automatic exposure controls because I think that they usually provide inferior results. This is not a consumer camera, even though Sony chose to put some consumer-oriented features on it. It's a professional camera, and I'm going to assume that you want to operate it in a professional manner. And if the mere thought of taking the camera off of automatic scares you, let me assure you that anyone can learn to shoot like a professional if they want to. There are 4 primary settings on the Z7 that affect exposure: iris, sometimes called aperture or f-stop, shutter speed, gain, and the neutral density filters. Now the first thing you need to understand is that controlling exposure isn't just about controlling how much light comes into the camera, because every change you make to the iris, gain, and shutter speed has consequences that will change the style and the look of the video you're shooting. For example, changing your aperture affects depth of field. Changing your gain affects the overall quality of the image. And changing the shutter speed will affect how motion is captured. Now, a discussion of basic photography concepts is not the purpose of this workshop, but if you don't understand things like aperture, shutter speed, motion blur, depth of field, sensor sensitivity, and other general photographic terms, then you may want to get some training in those areas. It is my belief that you can't be a good videographer if you aren't a good still photographer first. Any book on basic digital SLR photography will help because the concepts are generally the same for video. Let's talk about gain first. Gain is the same thing as ISO on a digital camera, and it determines how sensitive the CMOS image sensors are to the light that comes through the lens. A high gain setting means that the camera is more sensitive to light, but that comes at a price. Gain adds unwanted electronic noise to your image, so you should keep it set on the lowest practical setting that you can get away with. Now on the Z7, you might think that that would be 0 dB, because that's the default value of the L position on the gain switch, but you'd be incorrect. The Z7 can actually go below 0, down to -3 dB or even -6 dB. -3 and -6 are usually better than 0 dB because they reduce electronic noise in the picture, particularly in the shadows and darker areas of the frame. Granted, the difference is hard to see in some situations, but nevertheless, 0 dB should not be your default gain setting. Personally, I find that -3 provides a good balance between sensitivity, dynamic range, and electronic noise, but the choice is yours. To change the default settings of the 3 positions of the gain switch, press the menu button. Go to the Camera Set menu and choose Gain Setup. You can see the default values are 18 dB, 9 dB, and 0 dB. I'll highlight the L setting and select it. The choices range from -6 dB all the way up to +21 dB. I'm going to choose -3 dB for the L position on my camera and lock it in. Now we could press the menu button to finish and exit the menus, but as long as we're here, let's change the M setting to 0 dB and the H setting to plus 6 dB. Personally, 6 is as high as I would ever use, except in an emergency, so there's no reason for me to waste the high position on anything above 6 dB. But your needs might be different. For example, if you shoot documentaries in natural light, or if you work in news, then a higher value might be a better choice for you. Finally, I'll press the menu button again to lock in the choices and exit. Now while I'm out shooting, selecting any of the 3 customized gain settings is as simple as flipping the gain toggle switch, and I can see the changes it makes to the picture instantly. Maybe too quickly, really. What if you don't like the hard, abrupt, instant changes from one setting to another? In some shooting situations, particularly news, documentaries, and event videography, you might need to change the gain setting on the fly, and an abrupt change would be undesirable. Let's jump back to the camera set menu and choose the Smooth Gain submenu. Smooth Gain lets you control how fast the gain setting changes from one value to another when you flip the gain toggle switch on the side of the camera. Choosing fast, middle, or slow will make the camera gradually transition from one gain setting to another so the change is less noticeable to the viewer. Here's an example of flipping the gain switch with the menu setting turned off. And here's what it looks like with the menu setting on middle. See the difference? One gives you an abrupt, instant change, and the other gives you a smooth transition. Another gain-related menu is called Hypergain. Here's what it looks like. Obviously, this is for emergency use only, when picture quality isn't very important. The final gain menu is called Auto Gain Control Limit. You can use this menu to put a limit on how high the camera is allowed to raise the gain when you're shooting on automatic exposure mode. But you're not going to be shooting with automatic gain, right? So don't worry about it. The 2 most important things to remember about gain are this. 1, set it yourself manually, and 2, always use the lowest gain setting the lighting conditions will permit. So, although gain does affect exposure, it is not a setting you should change very often. I'd say that I shoot with -3 dB or -6 dB at least 99% of the time so that I get the cleanest and least noisy picture possible. The next setting that can affect exposure is shutter speed, but you should never change the shutter speed just to change the exposure. That's a big mistake a lot of shooters make. In still photography, yes, shutter speed is used to control the exposure, but not in video. If the shutter speed isn't set properly for the frame rate you're shooting with, you'll run the risk of getting blurry motion or a strobing effect. Here are some examples of various shutter speeds and how they affect the look of the video. And if you think shutter speed doesn't matter or audiences won't know the difference, you're wrong. So unless you purposely want your video to look different than normal, or you have some other unusual circumstance that requires a special shutter speed, here are the settings you should normally use for routine shooting. For 24p shooting, use a shutter speed of 1/48. For 30p shooting, use a shutter speed of 1/60. For 60i shooting, use a shutter speed of 1/60. For 50i shooting, use a shutter speed of 1/50. And for 25p shooting, use a shutter speed of 1/50. You can vary the shutter speed a little bit from these recommendations, but don't make the mistake of going too far. To change the shutter speed, just press the shutter speed button, and the shutter speed will be surrounded by a gray box on the display. Whenever you see the gray box, that means the shutter speed can be changed by spinning the select button. When you find the shutter speed you want, just press the select button to lock it in. Note that the gray box is now gone. I'm going to press the shutter button again to take a closer look at the choices we have. The range of available shutter speeds goes from 1/4 of a second all the way up to 1/10,000th of a second. Whenever the shutter speed gets slower than the frame rate, that's called slow shutter. At least that's what it would be called on other cameras. Sony doesn't call it that on the Z7, but that's what it is. For example, if you're shooting in the 30p recording mode, then a shutter speed of 1/15th, 1/8th, or 1/4 would be considered a slow shutter mode. It's a lot easier to understand if you see it in action, so let's look at some examples. Here's a shot after dusk with the shutter at 1/60th. The camera is shooting in the 30p mode right now, so 1/60th would be considered the normal shutter speed. This is the shutter speed at 1/30th, 1/15th, 1/8th, and 1/4. As you can see, slow shutter produces clear, noise-free video without turning on the gain. Just for comparison, here's what the shot would look like with 18 dB of gain to boost the sensitivity instead of using the slow shutter speed to get more light into the camera. In film production, shutter speed is traditionally referred to as shutter angle instead of shutter speed, but they are both just different terms for describing the same thing, only the terminology is different. It's kind of like having a digital speedometer in your car that will show miles per hour or kilometers per hour. Changing from one display to the other doesn't change how fast the car is going. It's just a different way of looking at the data. To change the shutter speed display mode, go to the Display Set menu, scroll down and select the Shutter Display submenu, and choose Degree. That's all there is to it. So the bottom line is that shutter speed on a video camera is not something you should change solely to adjust the exposure. Any changes you make to shutter speed should be motivated by some other reason, and any effect it has on exposure should be viewed as a side effect. The neutral density filter wheel is also a control that affects exposure. ND filters act like sunglasses for the camera. I'd say that a good rule of thumb is that if you think you need to wear sunglasses because it's a bright sunny day, then the camera will need them too. And one thing that I really like is that the Z7's ND filters have no color correcting properties, so they can be used both indoors and outdoors, and that's a great plus. Position number 1 is clear. No ND filtering is applied, and it allows maximum transmission of light. This is the setting you'll usually use indoors, at night, or anytime there isn't a whole lot of light. Position number 2 reduces the light by 75% and is equivalent to a standard 0.6 ND filter, which makes a 2 f-stop difference. Position number 3 reduces the light by 97% and is equivalent to a 1.2 ND filter, which is a 4 f-stop difference. And position number 4 reduces light by almost 99% and is equivalent to a 2.4 ND filter, which is a 6 f-stop difference. Which of the 4 ND filters you choose to use at any given time is determined purely by how much light there is on the scene and at what f-stop you would like to be shooting at. I usually choose whichever ND filter will keep my aperture between f2 and f4. That sounds like a narrow range, but most lenses, including this one, function at their best when using an aperture around f2.8 or f4. Plus, it helps to keep a shallow depth of field. The final, and by far the most important control on the camera for setting exposure is the iris, sometimes called the aperture or f-stop. Almost all of your exposure changes should be made using only the iris and the ND filters. The other two settings, shutter speed and gain, should rarely need changing, except in the most extreme shooting conditions. Now you can either let the camera choose the best aperture automatically by putting the iris switch on auto, or you can put it on manual and then change the iris yourself by turning the aperture ring directly. If you're an experienced shooter, you probably have your own method of setting the right exposure, and the good news is that you can just go right on doing things the same way with the Z7. You'll feel right at home with the camera. There's nothing to warn you about, nor are there any little secrets to share with you about setting exposure. But for the benefit of any less experienced shooters who may be watching, I'll explain my own technique of setting exposure with the Z7. First, let's look at the problems with using auto iris, because for best results, you don't want to leave the camera on auto exposure. Like all cameras, the Z7 views the world as if everything were a medium shade of gray. But we know it's not. Some things are bright white, some things are black, and very few things in the real world are exactly gray. But the camera can't tell what it is that you're shooting, so naturally, it will often get the exposure wrong. That's one problem with auto exposure. The second problem is that you don't want the camera's iris to visibly change during your shot. That's a clear sign of an amateur camera operator. So clearly, auto iris is usually not something that professionals should use very often. Controlling the iris manually is the best method because it's more accurate and it won't go changing on you in the middle of a shot. But it can be tricky to know which f-stop to use. Fortunately, the Z7 provides several different features to help you out. A couple of them only work when the camera's in full auto mode, so we'll just ignore those and spend time looking at the other features that will actually help you. The first feature is the push auto button on the lens, because a lot of times switching briefly to auto iris can help get you very close to the right exposure. Even when the iris switch is in the manual position, you can activate the auto iris function temporarily for as long as you hold down the push auto button. This allows the camera to determine what it thinks is the right exposure, and then you can release the button to lock that exposure in so it won't fluctuate during the shot. Of course, with this method, you're still relying on the camera to determine the correct exposure setting, which might not be perfect, but at least the camera is putting the iris in the right ballpark, and then you're locking it in so it won't change unexpectedly. A variation of this technique is to zoom into the main subject, hold down the push auto button, let the camera decide what it thinks is the correct exposure, release the button to lock it in, and then zoom out to reframe your shot. With either of these methods, if the camera got the exposure right, you're ready to roll. But how do you know if it got it right or not? Because like I said before, often the camera gets it wrong. The camera really doesn't know if the object you're shooting is bright white, dark black, medium yellow, or a shade of blue, because it treats everything it sees as if it were a medium shade of gray. Zebra is your best friend when it comes to checking your exposure. It's an important tool that you'll probably want to have turned on all of the time. By default, it's programmed into assign button number 4, and that's where I suggest you leave it. With the zebra turned on, a striped pattern appears, that's where the name comes from, on any part of the picture where the video level has exceeded the threshold that you programmed it for. Zebra is the video equivalent of the red line on a tachometer, or the red zone on an audio VU meter, because it warns you when highlights in your scene have exceeded a certain threshold. When you see the zebra pattern appear, that's like going into the red zone on your exposure. The default setting for zebra is 70%, but here you can see that I have mine programmed for 95%. You can go into the menus and set your own zebra between 70% and 100%, or even 100 plus, which is about 110%. Now, what value should you use for your zebra setting? I can't answer that question for you because there are too many variables. It will depend on your style of shooting, the subject matter, and the picture profile settings that you've chosen. But let me say that I think that the default setting of 70% is too low to be of any use. For years I've heard some people claim 70% is perfect for setting exposure on skin tones when they're shooting an interview. But what shade of skin are they talking about? Even among Caucasians, there is no uniform skin tone. Unless everyone has the same shade of skin, an arbitrary setting like 70% is not very helpful. I have my zebra set for 95% because that's what I've determined works best for me whenever there's something white in the shot. The Z7 also offers a histogram function that can be turned on to show a real-time indication of the exposure. Sony has taken this feature one step further by adding what they call an advanced histogram indicator. What this does is add an indicator represented by a vertical red line that shows you the brightness level at the very center of the frame, kind of like measuring exposure with a spot meter. And if you have your zebra turned on at the same time as the histogram, you'll see a yellow vertical line in the histogram display, indicating the threshold you have set the zebra for. So if you like to use histograms, then you've got a couple of different variations to choose from on the Z7. Now, before we end this chapter, there are 4 additional menu settings that you'll want to know about. Let's go to the camera set menu and scroll down until we come to these submenus here: AE Shift, AE Window, AE Response, and Auto Iris Limit. Auto Exposure Shift allows you to offset the value of the camera's auto exposure settings by an amount that you choose. For example, suppose that you decide that you want to use Auto Iris or the Push Auto button, but you think that the camera is consistently under or overexposed in the picture. Well, you can tell the camera to add or subtract a certain amount of light to whatever f-stop the camera would have chosen on its own. You can see how it works as I spin the select dial to change the setting while I have auto iris turned on. A good example of when to use this feature is if you're shooting outdoors in the snow or at the beach on a bright sunny day. In situations like that, the camera will tend to underexpose the picture, so you'd want to try setting the AE shift to +1, +2, or maybe even higher to compensate. Auto exposure window is a feature that lets you tell the camera which part of the frame to use when it calculates the auto exposure settings. If you have any experience in still photography, you might recognize that this setting is kind of like changing the metering mode on an SLR from full screen, center weighted, or spot metering. It's the same concept. Normally the camera looks at the entire frame to decide what the best exposure should be. But because it doesn't know what you're shooting or which part of the frame is most important, the exposure it chooses may be wrong. For example, what if you're shooting outdoor landscapes and the bright sky is causing the camera to underexpose? Well, maybe you'd want to try choosing window type 1 so the camera doesn't factor in the top part of the frame. Or maybe if you're shooting an interview, choosing window type 4 will help tell the camera that it's the middle of the frame you want to give priority to. Now, none of these 5 choices is going to be better than setting the exposure manually using the techniques I've already discussed, but at least they give you a little bit more control, and that is always a good thing. Auto exposure response lets you customize how quickly the camera changes the exposure when it senses a change in the brightness of the picture. The fast setting will make the camera react quicker, but the slow setting will be less abrupt and provide smoother, less noticeable changes. If you're going to shoot with auto iris turned on, then slow is a good choice. Auto iris limit allows you to put a limit on how small you allow the camera to make the aperture. As I mentioned before, the Z7 performs best at apertures above f5.6, and large apertures also give you a shallower depth of field. So if you want to prevent the auto iris from going below f5.6, f4.8, or whatever value you choose, you can program a limit here with this menu. There are 3 ways of focusing the Z7: full manual, full automatic, or a combination of both. Now in this chapter, I'm only going to be talking about how the camera functions with either the stock Zeiss lens that comes with the camera or the optional wide-angle Zeiss lens that we'll talk about a little bit later. If you choose to shoot with a different lens, then some of the functions I'm going to talk about, particularly autofocus and steady shot, are going to work differently or not at all. Autofocus on the Z7 and the S270 actually works quite well. Now, some experienced shooters may not like the idea of using autofocus, and I have to admit that I don't use it very often myself, but I suggest that you give it a try before dismissing it entirely. As I pointed out earlier, the Z7 doesn't have a high-resolution viewfinder, so getting the focus right, particularly if you're shooting handheld, shooting outdoors in bright light, or trying to follow focus on a moving subject, can be challenging. Let's take a closer look at the different focusing modes that the Z7 offers. If you want to use the full autofocus mode, simply slide the focus ring towards the lens hood. Now the Z7 will attempt to do all the focusing for you. The good news is that it's pretty accurate and very fast. The bad news is that your subject really needs to be close to the center of the frame because that's where the camera is usually going to focus. If you have the center mark turned on, that will tell you about where the camera is going to focus in the autofocus mode. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, good composition, particularly when shooting interviews, doesn't put the subject dead center in the frame, if you follow the rule of thirds. The best time to use full auto is when you need to follow focus with a moving subject, as long as you keep it in the center of the frame. Once the camera locks on the target, it does a really good job of tracking it. So with moving subjects that are located in the center of the frame, I've learned that the camera will probably do a better job than I could do myself manually. Obviously, the complete opposite of full autofocus, where you give up all control to the camera, is full manual focus, where you have total control. Full manual focus is turned on by sliding the focus ring towards the rear of the camera. The position of the other focus controls and menu settings don't make any difference now because they're completely disabled when the focus ring is in this position. In full manual mode, you'll find that the focusing is very smooth and responsive to the touch. I've got nothing but good things to say about how manual focus works on the Z7. So if you're an experienced shooter who's wary of using autofocus, then just stick with manual focus. However, as I said at the beginning of this chapter, the Z7 offers some modes that combine certain elements of manual and automatic focusing that can make your job easier when they're used smartly. I call these the hybrid focus modes. Let's take a look. First of all, let's assume for a minute that you mostly want to shoot with autofocus turned on. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that as long as you recognize and accept the fact that the camera is going to mess it up sometimes. Now, one technique is to let the camera focus automatically and then switch over to manual focus to lock it in. Unfortunately, you can't switch smoothly back and forth between focus modes by sliding the focus ring because the focal point will shift and it makes a lot of noise when you do it. So here's how to do it the right way. Press the menu button, go to the Others menu, choose Assign button, choose Camera, choose one of the 6 Assign buttons. It can be any one of them you want, but I'm going to use number 2. Scroll until you see Focus, and then lock that in. Press the menu button again to exit. Now slide the focus ring forward to the automatic position. Okay, we're back in the full automatic mode, but now there's a new twist. Once the camera is successfully focused on the subject, we can lock it in by pressing Assign button number 2 to turn off the autofocus function without physically moving the focus ring. Even if the camera or the subject moves, the lens will stay focused where it is. I can even manually focus a lens now without the camera resisting my efforts. The hand icon is there to remind me that I'm in the hybrid focusing mode and autofocusing is turned off for the moment. The approximate focal distance is displayed in feet. When you reach the farthest focusing limit, the focus ring will still keep right on spinning, but the hand changes to a mountain and the distance readout is replaced by an infinity icon. At the other end of the scale, when the lens can't focus any closer, the icon changes to the silhouette of a person. To turn autofocusing back on, I just push Assign button number 2. If I wanted to go back to manual focus, push number 2 again. If I want to go back to autofocus, push number 2 again. This technique is very easy to get used to and combines the convenience of autofocus and the consistency of manual focus. So that's a good way to switch briefly to manual focus if you want to use automatic most of the time. But what if you want to do just the opposite? What if you want to focus manually most of the time, but briefly switch to autofocus occasionally? There's a good way to do that too. Press the menu button, go back to the Others menu, and choose Assign button. This time, instead of choosing one of the camera's assigned buttons, let's choose Lens, and then L1. That's the button located here on the side of the lens. The digital extender function that this button is programmed for by default is pretty useless, so let's change it to one push autofocus, and then lock it in. Press the menu button again to exit, and then double check to make sure the focus ring is still in the forward position. Next, verify that the camera is still in manual focus. If you don't see the hand icon, press Assign button number 2 to turn autofocus off. Now let's say that this is our preferred mode of working. We're going to focus the camera manually most of the time, but sometimes we may want to switch to auto and let the camera do the focusing for us. That's easy to do now. All we have to do is press down on Assign button L1 and then the autofocusing will be activated for as long as we hold down the button. As soon as we release the button, autofocusing stops and locks in on whatever it's focused on. I really like this mode in a lot of situations. I just put the crosshairs over whatever I want to be in focus, hold the button down for a second, release it, and then frame the shot up the way I want it. No matter what happens, the focal point will not change unless I want it to. Now, if that's still not enough focusing options for you, here's another one. Make sure the focus ring is still in the forward position to activate autofocus. Next, go to the Camera Set menu, scroll down to Autofocus Assist, and turn it on. Now, even when the camera is in autofocus mode, you can still turn the autofocus ring manually to override the automatic control and focus on whatever you want. But watch out. The camera is still technically in autofocus mode, and if it doesn't agree with how you focus the lens, or if the subject moves, the camera will refocus the lens again, all on its own. Because autofocus assist can result in unwanted focus changes and you'll actually be fighting against the camera for control sometimes, I can't recommend using this mode very often. But I do leave the menu setting turned on so that I have the freedom to override autofocus anytime I want. I just have to keep in mind that the focus might not stay where I put it. Now, you might be wondering why the focus ring even has two positions. If the Z7 can do manual focus in either one, what's the reason for two? Well, in case you hadn't noticed, the full manual focus position is the only mode where you have direct physical control of the optics. In the other modes, the focus ring is just performing as a servo and you aren't actually turning the glass yourself. Watch this. In the full manual focus mode, the distance scale moves because I'm actually turning the internal optics directly with my finger, and the focusing reaches hard limits for infinity and close-up at the other end. The lens won't turn any further, so it makes it really easy to focus quickly on distant objects or something close by on the fly. If you shoot news or documentaries, you'll appreciate the importance of that feature. I said earlier that the lens behaves like a real broadcast lens, and this is one of the reasons I said that. For comparison, let's slide the focus ring forward to the other position. Now the focus ring rotates endlessly. There are no physical stops to let you know when you've reached the limit, and notice that the distance scale isn't changing anymore, because I'm not actually turning the glass directly. In fact, the whole feel of the focusing is diminished, and manual focusing will be a little harder in this mode. My reason for pointing this out is to show you that the two lens settings are not the same. If you won't be using full autofocus or one of the hybrid modes very often, keep the focus ring in the rear position. Even if you're used to focusing manually with bigger shoulder-mounted cameras, you're going to find that focusing the Z7 manually is going to test your skills because the LCD viewfinder isn't as good as the CRT viewfinders you've used before. Now fortunately, the camera offers a couple of features to help you out. First is peaking, which can be turned on from the menus or programmed into one of the assign buttons. I've already set it up for assign button number 1 on my camera. All I have to do is press the button at any time to turn it on or off. When peaking is turned on, the edges of objects within the picture take on a brighter outline whenever they come into sharp focus. So when you see the peaking signal appear around the edges of something in the frame, then it's probably in focus. If you want to have peaking turned on all the time, then it will probably be a waste to use up one of your assign buttons on it. In that case, go to the Display Set menu, choose Peaking, and then turn it on. You can also control the intensity of the peaking display. I like to have mine set on high because the other two don't seem strong enough to see outdoors. Another feature on the Z7 that can help with focusing is called Expanded Focus. Expanded Focus is activated by pressing the L2 assign button on the lens to digitally magnify the picture on the LCD and in the viewfinder. In the interlaced recording modes, it magnifies the picture 2x, and in the progressive modes, only 1.5x. This close-up view can really help you check the focus very precisely. To turn it off, you just press the button again. Expanded Focus is purely a monitoring function, and it does not affect the image that's being recorded. In fact, Expanded Focus doesn't even work while the camera is recording. It only works in standby mode. I like this feature and I wish I could use it all the time, but I can't. Here's why. Expanded Focus will not work if the memory recording unit is attached to the rear of the camera and turned on. And since I record on compact flash cards with the MRU 100% of the time, Expanded Focus is never available to me. So if you find Expanded Focus isn't working on your camera, now you'll know why. Another tool to help with manual focusing is called focus marking. Say for example that you want to record a shot where you rack focus from this flower to this other flower. Now one way of doing it perfectly would be to set up an automated shot transition, which is covered in another chapter. But another way to do it is with focus marking. First, make sure the camera is in full manual focus by sliding the focus ring towards the rear of the camera. If the focus ring is in the forward position, focus marking won't work. Now let's go to the Camera Set menu, and then scroll down to the Shot Transition Focus Marking submenu. This menu is what determines whether these buttons under the handle are going to function as shot transition buttons or as focus marking buttons. You can't use both functions at the same time. Let's choose focus marking right now and then press the menu button to exit. Now press the check button to turn on focus marking. Notice the new line that extends across the screen. If I turn the focus ring, you can see the icon move back and forth to indicate the current focal point. Let's say that this is going to be our first mark, so we press button A, and the A mark appears. Then we change the focus to our second mark, press the B button, and the B mark appears. Now we can manually focus between the two objects a lot easier by watching the icons on the display. When you hit one of the marks right on, the icon changes color to let you know. But don't worry too much about getting it perfect. It's hard to hit the exact right spot every time, and if you're slightly off one way or the other, I doubt it will make much difference. If you really need it perfect, then you might want to consider setting up a shot transition instead. Before we finish this chapter, there's one more very important part of focusing that I've ignored until now. Because this camera has a removable lens, adjusting the back focus, particularly after changing the lens, is critical to getting sharp images. If you find that your focus is sharp when you're zoomed all the way in, but soft when zoomed out, then you need to adjust the back focus. I've exaggerated the effect here to make it really obvious, but even a slight misalignment will cause your video to look soft. Sony calls this problem flange adjustment, but I'm going to stick with the more common term, back focus. Anytime you put the Zeiss lens back on the camera, here's what you should do. Take the back focus chart that was included with your camera and place it 7 to 10 feet away. Zoom in and put the center of the card in the center of the screen. Having the center marker display turned on is a big help. Now put the iris on automatic and make sure that there's enough light to get a good exposure. Ideally, you want the iris to be between f2 and f4. Go to the camera set menu, scroll down to the flange back submenu and select it. Now you can either let the camera adjust the back focus automatically or you can try and do it yourself. I'm going to recommend that you let the camera do it for you. Choose Auto Adjust and answer yes. The camera will make its adjustments and then you're ready to shoot. But if you get an error message, try moving the card to a different location, changing the angle of the card, or adjusting the lighting, and then try it again. It's really pretty simple. So that's how you adjust back focus with the Zeiss lens, but what about other lenses? Well, you'll have to figure that out on your own, but on most lenses, the back focus is adjusted by loosening a knob at the rear of the lens and then turning the last element. Zooming with the Zeiss lens is pretty straightforward and there's nothing groundbreaking to show you on the Z7, so this will be a short chapter. I'm just going to point out a few things that you might not have noticed yet. Let's start with manual zoom. I think this is the first lens that I've owned where it's okay to manually zoom the lens at any time, even when the zoom select switch is still in the servo position. There's a little bit of stiffness, but you're not grinding the gears or doing any damage like you do with other lenses. Of course, if you want the smoothest manual zoom performance possible, then you should slide the switch down under the lens over to the manual setting. You'll find that there's a big difference in how the lens feels between the two positions. Another unusual thing is that the zoom control in the Z7's handle has a variable speed control, and that's something I've never seen before on Sony cameras. If you slide the switch to the variable position, you'll be able to execute much smoother zooms where you can accelerate slowly at the beginning, ramp up to the speed you want, and then gradually slow back down before completing the zoom. It takes some practice to get the technique down, and I wouldn't say that it's as easy to use as the full-size rocker switch on the hand grip, but it's not that bad, and I find myself using it quite often. Now you may have noticed the digital extender button on the side of the lens. When you press it, the image is magnified electronically by 50%. Notice I said electronically. This is just a consumerish effect that magnifies the picture by enlarging the pixels at the expense of picture quality. Please do not use this feature. And besides that, you might not be able to use it anyway. If you're shooting with any of the progressive modes, the digital extender function doesn't work. It only works in the regular interlaced modes. White balance on the Z7 can be as simple or as complicated as you want to make it. And since the Z7 isn't an entry-level camera, I'm going to assume that you already know what white balance is and why it's important to the look of the images you shoot. But if you feel like you need a quick refresher course on white balance, then I suggest visiting this website or even getting a book on basic digital SLR photography. Let's begin with the camera's automatic white balance setting. If the auto manual switch is in auto, then white balance is being processed automatically and you'll have no control over the color, not to mention iris, gain, shutter speed, and most other camera settings. Now, even if the auto manual switch is in the manual position, you still might be in automatic white balance mode. The only way to know for sure is to look at the lower right corner of the LCD monitor or viewfinder and see if one of the white balance icons is shown. In this case, there's no icon, so we can tell from that the camera must be in automatic white balance mode. To put the camera in manual white balance mode, press the white balance button. And now this toggle switch below it is what will determine your actual white balance setting. And the camera will stay in manual mode until you press the white balance button again. Even if you turn the camera off, it will still be in manual mode whenever you turn it back on. Notice that now there's an icon being displayed on the LCD to tell us that the camera is using whatever color temperature that has previously been recorded into white balance memory A. If the toggle switch was in the B position, then we'd see a B icon. Or if it was in the preset position, we'd see either a sun icon to indicate an outdoors preset value, or a light bulb icon to indicate an indoors preset. Let's talk about preset first. Preset puts the camera on a predefined white balance setting that won't fluctuate in the middle of a shot, so that makes it better than automatic white balance, but it doesn't actually take the current lighting conditions into consideration. The default value for preset is 3200K, which is intended for indoor shooting. But if you think that you'll be more likely to use preset when you're outdoors, then you'll want to change the preset value to 5600K. To do that, you go to the camera set menu. Scroll down to white balance preset and select it. Now you can change the preset from indoor to outdoor or even choose manual white balance temperature. Now, manual white balance temperature is an interesting function to use if you consider yourself a white balance expert. Otherwise, I'd say leave it alone. But let's select it anyway to see how it works. After we exit the menus and make sure the toggle switch is on preset, I can press the white balance one push button and then turn the select wheel to manually dial in any color temperature I want from 2300K up to 15,000K. If you know what you're doing, this can be a very handy control for setting a very precise color temperature. But for now, let's go back to the white balance preset menu and change it to outdoor instead. The default color temperature for the outdoor preset is 5600K, but you can override that value to make it a little warmer or a little cooler. Here's how. Make sure the sun icon is shown on the display, and then press the white balance one push button. Notice the white balance icon has changed. Now you can turn the select dial one way or the other to make the picture cooler or warmer to get the desired look that you want. This preset override will stay in effect even if the camera is turned off and then back on again. I rarely use preset. As with any camera, the only accurate way to control the white balance is to set it manually and then re-white balance as often as necessary when the lighting conditions change. You can save two separate custom white balances into the A and B memory positions. To set a manual white balance, select position A or B, aim the camera at a white card that is under the same lighting conditions as that of the subject you'll be shooting. Zoom in until you've filled most of the frame, set the exposure to automatic, press the white balance one push button, wait a second for the camera to adjust the color, and when the icon stops flashing, you're ready to shoot. Later, if lighting conditions change, or if you move to a new location, then you'll need to set the white balance again. However, a technically perfect white balance isn't always the best setting because it doesn't result in pleasing skin tones. Sometimes you'll want to fine-tune the white balance a little bit. By white balancing on a special warming card, such as those available from warmcards.com, you can very easily trick the camera's white balance into delivering warmer, richer images than a pure white card would provide. All you have to do is substitute one of the warm cards for the white card you'd normally use and set your white balance by pressing the button. Here's a side-by-side example I shot with my EX1 camcorder a few months ago for another video. Look at the difference when I switch back and forth between a true white balance on memory A and a warm balance on memory B. You can really see the difference. There are many other ways of manipulating the white balance, but there's still nothing as easy, convenient, or predictable as using warm cards. For creative shooting and advanced image control, the Z7 allows you to define your own paint settings through the Picture Profile menu. Up to 6 different picture profiles can be saved on board the camcorder, and each profile can store about a dozen custom camera settings so that you can quickly and easily change the look of the camera without having to go into the menus and modify a dozen different settings one at a time. The Picture Profile menu system is completely separate from the regular menu system, and it's accessed by pressing the Picture Profile button. The Z7 arrives from the factory with 4 pre-programmed picture profiles, plus 2 additional profiles that have no settings unless you program them yourself from scratch. In other words, when you first get your camera, PP1 and PP2 are no different than just turning the picture profile off. Now, as you can see here on my camera, I've already customized PP2 and given it a custom name called Vortex 1. In fact, most of the footage you've seen on this DVD was shot with either Vortex 1, Pro Color, or Film Look 1. Why those 3? Simply because those are the looks that I prefer for my video. Picture profile settings are purely subjective. There are no right or wrong picture profiles. Each of the 6 profiles has a dozen different menus that can be changed, and each of those menus has from 2 to 6 subsettings that can be further changed. So it goes way beyond the scope of this DVD for me to try and describe what each one of them does or when to change them. That would take a whole DVD all on its own. And just because there are dozens of settings and thousands of combinations of settings does not mean that you should feel the need to start changing them. That's the wrong way of approaching picture profiles. The proper approach to picture profiles is to view them as tools to modify the camera's image quality when necessary to achieve specific results, not just as options to be played around with to see what happens if you change this or change that. You've heard the saying, don't fix it if it ain't broke? Well, there's no reason to mess around with the picture profile settings unless you have a specific look you're trying to achieve. If there's something about the image that you don't like, maybe highlights are being blown out, the detail is too sharp, the image looks flat and dull, or you want to match the picture on another camera, then go into the Picture Profile toolbox and adjust the setting or settings that will give you the look you desire. You might be interested to learn that I've owned my Z1U for 3.5 years and I've used the same picture profile the whole time. I've owned my F350 XT-Cam HD camera for 2.5 years and I only use one scene file. I've had my EX1 for 10 months and I'm still shooting with the same picture profile that I created the first week I got the camera. Personally, I think once you get the camera set up the way you like it to look, I don't see any need to constantly be changing profiles from shot to shot. Now, some people might think that the picture quality of the Z7 looks good enough right out of the box. Well, while it does look pretty good, it doesn't look good enough for me. The factory default look is a little flat and washed out for my taste. And with a high-end camera like this, that's the way it should be. Sony purposely engineers the default settings of their Pro cameras to be somewhat neutral, so that individual users can more easily make their own custom adjustments to get the exact look that they want. Now, as I said, a whole DVD could be produced just on paint settings alone, so there isn't time to get into too much detail here. And besides that, the changes that you can make are mostly just a matter of personal preference anyway. What looks good to me might not look good to you, and vice versa. However, with that said, here are the settings that I use for the picture profile I call Vortex 1. For black level, I have the master black set to -1 to give me slightly richer blacks. For gamma, I like the look of ITU 709. For black gamma, I prefer high with a level of -3. For knee, I use manual as the mode and set the point to 100% and the slope to 0. For color mode, I use Cinematone 1 and a setting of 5 for the level. For color level, I use +1. Color level increases or decreases the amount of color saturation in the picture. A positive number makes the colors more vibrant, while a lower number, such as -8, makes the picture appear black and white. Color phase is set on 0. Color phase affects the overall tint of the picture and shouldn't be confused with color balance. I'll leave all of the color depth settings at 0. Color correction is off, but we'll come back to this one in a minute because there are some interesting special effects you can do with this setting. I leave white balance shift on the default settings. White balance shift can be used to automatically increase or decrease the color temperature whenever you set a custom white balance. I leave detail set on 0. Detail is basically a sharpness setting, and you want to be careful about making your video appear over-sharpened. And skin tone detail is off. Skin tone detail can be used when needed to try and make facial skin look more pleasing by smoothing out imperfections, wrinkles, and blemishes. So that's my personal picture profile settings, but there's nothing scientific about it. They're just the settings that I happen to like the look of most of the time. In fact, they're really just a variation of picture profile number 3 called Pro Color. If you don't want to take the time to create your own picture profile, I highly recommend Pro Color because, in my opinion, it looks a lot better than using no picture profile at all. I'll show you a couple of comparisons between the Z7's default settings, Vortex 1, and the other 4 profiles that come pre-programmed. This is off. Then Vortex 1, Pro Color, which Sony describes as using settings that match a professional shoulder mount camera with ITU 709 gamma, PD Color, which Sony describes as matching the settings of a camcorder with PD gamma, Film Look 1, which Sony describes as matching Cinema Color negative film, and Film Look 2, which Sony describes as matching Cinema Color print film. Here we go again. Off, Vortex 1, Pro Color, PD Color, Film Look 1, and Film Look 2. Off, Vortex 1, Pro Color, PD Color, Film Look 1, and Film Look 2. I liked a lot about Pro Color when I first saw it, but it wasn't exactly what I wanted. So I could have gone in and modified Pro Color directly, but I wanted to leave it untouched. So what I did instead was to copy all the settings from PP3 over to PP2, and then I modified PP2 to look the way I wanted. And finally, I renamed it Vortex 1. Here's how to do all of that. Let's say, for example, that we like the look of Film Look 2, but for some reason we want to create a black and white version of it with more sharpness. First, we scroll down to PP6 and select it. Choose Setting, scroll down to Copy, and press the Select button. Now we can decide which of the other 5 profiles to copy PP6 to. Let's choose PP1 because it's still in the default settings anyway. I answer yes, and the copying is done. PP1 is now exactly the same as PP6, but now we want to modify it. I'll choose Return, and return again to get back to the main picture profile page. Choose Setting, then Color Level, change it to -8 in order to make it virtually black and white, then go to Detail and increase it to +2 to make the picture a little sharper. If we wanted to give this profile a custom name, we could go to Profile Name and change it to something like Black and White Film Look, but I'm not going to waste our time going through those steps. So now we've given PP1 a totally new look that we can call up instantly anytime we want to use it. And if we ever decide that we don't want it anymore, we can always go back into the Settings menu and choose Reset to put it back on the default values, including any custom name that you gave it. One more thing I want to cover in this chapter is a setting we skipped earlier called Color Correction. Color correction is an interesting special effect that allows you to adjust certain colors in the scene without affecting other colors. For example, here I've turned the entire picture black and white except for the blue and red stripes on the sail. There are 2 types of color correction effects. Color extraction is the easiest to use and basically consists of turning the whole picture black and white and then adding a certain color back into the picture, like the stripes on the sailboat. The colors we add back in are called the target colors. You can have either 1 or 2 target colors. Here, target 1 is the blue stripe and target 2 is the red stripe. In this example, target 1 is the apple and target 2 is the banana. Everything else is black and white. Either one of the target colors or both target colors at the same time can be displayed. The second special effect is called color revision. Instead of turning the picture black and white, the entire image remains in color, but the target colors can have their hue shifted a little bit. The emphasis is on little. You aren't going to be able to turn the banana blue because the range of adjustment is fairly slight. Probably the best use of color revision is to boost the color of an object to make it more intense. For example, if you wanted the apple to be even redder, you could use color revision to boost it. Or if you had a client who was very particular about the color of their logo in the scene, and you couldn't quite get it perfect without also shifting all the other colors in the scene, then you could use color revision to isolate the logo color and tweak it all by itself. Let's walk through an example, and we might as well stick with the bowl of fruit to see how the effects we just saw were done. First, you should manually white balance the camera and keep it set in manual mode, because if the white balance shifts during shooting, then all of the other color correction settings would be adversely affected. I usually keep PP1 reserved as the profile I use for temporary special effects. Choose Setting and scroll down to Color Correct, and then go to Type. You always need to choose Color Extract first. Even if you really intend on doing a color revision effect, you have to start with Extract first so you can select a target color. Notice that the picture is now black and white. All the color has been extracted, and we are about to add in a designated target color back into the picture. First, we have to tell the camera if we're going to add one or two target colors back into the picture. In this example, we want to make the apple appear red and the banana appear yellow. So let's go to Memory Select and choose 1 and 2. Next, we select Memory 1 Color to define the first target color. That will be the apple. We can define the color manually by adjusting these three settings, but a better way is to choose One Push Set. Now all we have to do is zoom into the apple and press the Select button. It's really the same way you'd use the eyedropper tool in Photoshop to pick a color. Now let's do the same thing for the banana. We choose Memory 2 Color, One Push Set, zoom into the banana, and press Select. That's it. We've just successfully done a color extract effect on not one, but two target colors. Everything in the picture is black and white except for the apple and the banana. In fact, we can easily turn on or off either target color independently with the Memory Select submenu. Now, if creating a color extract effect was our only goal, then we'd be done and we could start shooting. But let's say we really wanted to do a color revision effect to make the apple appear redder and the banana slightly greener. Well, we haven't wasted our time, because in order to do a color revision, you always have to start with a color extract first to define the target colors. So let's go back to the Color Correct menu and change the type to Color Revision. Notice that the whole picture is back in full color and looks normal. Memory Select is still set for both 1 and 2, and that's the way we want it, because we're going to change both the red apple and the yellow banana. We already programmed Memory 1 Color for the red apple, so we won't touch that. Let's go down to Memory 1 Revision, select R Gain, and crank it up as far as it will go. Notice that the apple is a lot redder now. We could have gone the other way and reduced the color, but instead we wanted to make it redder for this example. Now we'll select OK to lock it in and go to Memory 2 Revision and change the hue of the banana. As you can see, the range of possible color change isn't that wide, and you have no control over saturation or luminance. That's as green as you're going to get it. Returning to the Type menu, you can toggle between Off, Color Revision, and Color Extract to see the effect. Notice that the color revision changes that we made are now seen in the Color Extract mode also. The only difference between the two settings is that the rest of the picture is converted to black and white in the Color Extract mode. Color correction settings are retained as part of the picture profile memory until you change them again. As I'm sure you know, timecode is an embedded signal recorded with the video so that every frame has a unique identifying number with digits representing hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. Timecode is a must for accurate editing, logging, and batch capturing if you're shooting on tape. But if you're going to be recording on the compact flash cards instead of tape, then timecode isn't as important because there's no more logging and capturing. All the normal SMPTE timecode features are included on the Z7, with most of the controls that you'd expect to find on any professional camcorder, including a choice of free run, record run, drop frame, non-drop frame, and definable user bits. The timecode settings can be accessed by pressing the menu button, and then selecting the timecode user bits submenu. A starting timecode number can be set here. In most productions, the hour number is used to designate the tape number. For example, tape 1 would start at hour 1, tape 2 at hour 2, and so forth. Timecode countup is a time-saving shortcut for starting each new tape at the next hour of timecode. For example, let's say that we just finished shooting tape number 1 and the timecode ends up at something like this. So I eject the tape and put in a new blank tape. Now I could reset the numbers manually and start tape number 2 at 2 hours even, but an easier way is to execute timecode countup. The hour automatically goes up one number and the minutes, seconds, and frames are reset to 0 in one easy step. User bits can be programmed to a custom value. Often this is used to identify specific cameras in a multi-camera shoot or to record the date. Either non-drop or drop frame mode can be selected. For most non-broadcast applications where precise program timing isn't called for, you should leave this set on non-drop. Either record run or free run mode can be selected. In record run mode, the timecode only advances when the camera is recording. And in free run mode, the numbers are always changing, like a clock, even when the camera is not recording, including when the camera is turned off. Normally, you'll want to leave this on record run. The timecode make menu allows you to choose either regenerate or preset to avoid having unwanted breaks in your timecode. Normally, you'll leave this on preset, and you should be aware that the timecode countup function we looked at a minute ago only works if this setting is on preset. TC-Link is useful if you want to jam sync two camcorders together via the FireWire port so that they have matching timecodes. It's nice to have this option on multi-camera shoots. User bits time record is a handy feature not usually found on most professional camcorders. Whenever you're not using the user bits for anything else, turn this feature on to have the internal real-time clock recorded as user bits. That way you can always tell exactly what time of day something was recorded. User bits date, timecode time will let you save the date and time as user bits, but only when your timecode mode is in free run. Now, if all that is too complicated to try and remember, here's all you really need to know for basic operation. Put TC make on preset, put TC run on record run, put TC format on non-drop frame, ignore UB preset and all the other user bit options. Use TC preset to start the timecode numbers at the head of the first tape at 1 hour, and then use the TC countup function whenever you put in a new tape. That's it. The shot transition function allows for smooth, automatic transitions between two different groups of memorized camera settings. In other words, you can program one group of camera settings into memory A and another group of settings into memory B, and then seamlessly transition back and forth between the two settings live while you record. Here's an example. I press A, and then I press B. However, you need to know right up front that shot transitions are only possible if you're using the stock Zeiss lens or the optional wide-angle Zeiss lens. If you're using another brand of lens such as Fujinon or Canon, then the shot transitions cannot be used. Now, what settings can be changed during the shot transition? Any combination of zoom, focus, iris, gain, shutter speed, and white balance. But naturally, any settings that you want to be part of the transition will need to be in the automatic mode, otherwise the camera won't be able to change them. An exception to that is the iris. Changes to the iris will happen no matter which position the auto iris switch is in. Probably the best use of shot transition is to execute a rack focus, because hitting your mark perfectly with the Z7 or the S270 can be challenging. So let's walk through an example. Let's say you want to rack focus from this wooden figure to the flowers and simultaneously zoom in a little bit. The first step before you record shots A and B into memory is to adjust the shot transition settings with the menus. First, go to the Camera Set menu and scroll down to the Shot Transition Focus Mark submenu and make sure that it's set for Shot Transition. Now go to the Shot Transition submenu. First of all, How long do you want the transition from A to B to last? You can program the duration from 3.5 seconds all the way up to 60 seconds. Let's choose 5 seconds for this example. Next, you can set Start Timer so that there's a delay before the transition happens after you press the button. This is a good choice if you're concerned that you might jiggle the camera a little when you press the button to start the transition, or if you want to press the button and have time to get your hands positioned on the camera to pan, tilt, or make some other move while the transition happens. I'll leave it turned off for this example, but I think it's often a good idea to program it for a 5-second delay. Record link will cause the camera to execute the transition as soon as you press the record button to start recording. I don't recommend using this setting, or you'll have no footage at the head of the clip for editing, and you'll probably bobble the camera a little when you press the record button anyway. If you choose this option, you should at least use the wireless remote control to trigger the recording so that you don't touch the camera. And finally, you can tell the camera whether or not you want to allow it to change the focus, zoom, and/or iris as part of the transition. I recommend that you leave them all turned on, regardless of what kind of transition you're setting up. You might have noticed that, unlike the Z1 and the EX1, there isn't any menu option to change the transition curve to customize how the effect executes. It is what it is. Now that we've chosen the settings we want to use, I'll push the menu button to exit the menus, and then press the Shot Transition button to start programming the two A and B shots. Notice that the camera is in the store mode now. If I press the button again, we can cycle through check, execute, off, and back to store. While it's in the store mode, the camera will memorize the camera's current settings whenever the A or B button is pressed. Let's set up the A shot the way we want it to look. And then press A. Shot A has been memorized. Now let's set up shot B the way we want it to look by changing both the zoom and the focus. And then press B to memorize this shot. I'll press the transition button again to go to the check mode, and then press button A. The camera will quickly change to the shot A settings, regardless of the duration you selected or any start timer delay you may have programmed with the menus. I'll press B now to double check that shot. And everything looks good. Next, I'll press the transition button again to go to the execute mode, and we're ready to record our shot. I start recording, and then when I press the A button, the camera will execute the transition just as I programmed it to do. I can also press the B button to do the same transition in reverse. It goes both ways, so there's really no difference between A and B or which order you program them in. If you want to change the transition speed or any other settings, you can go back to the menus and your A and B shot should still be remembered when you come back. But both memories are wiped out if you turn off power to the camera. As we saw earlier, the Z7 has two XLR inputs with a choice of line level or mic level for each input, plus a 48-volt phantom power setting, a choice of automatic or manual gain control, and separate level controls for each channel. It's all pretty straightforward stuff if you've ever used a professional camcorder before. But what might be new to you are the audio menus, so let's take a look. At first, the audio set menu page looks deceptively simple, but you'll find it gets a little more complicated as we go along. The first menu can be ignored if you're shooting with any of the HDV modes because the HDV bitrate is set automatically. If you're shooting in either of the DV or DV cam modes, then you'll want to leave it on 48K for the best quality sound. The next menu enables or disables the built-in limiter. If you've chosen to set the audio recording levels yourself by putting either of these switches in the manual position, then you'll have the choice of using the limiter or not. The limiter can help prevent audio clipping when the volume gets unexpectedly high, but you'll want to do some testing of your own to see if it suits your needs. Personally, I usually leave it turned off. Next, when you select the XLR Set submenu, a whole new layer of options is presented to you. XLR Auto Gain Control Link is first. If you choose separate, the auto gain control is applied independently to each channel. That's the setting you'll want to leave it on if you have two different sources coming into the XLRs, such as a lavalier on channel 1 and a boom mic on channel 2. But linked might be a good choice if you're recording a single stereo microphone. Audio manual gain allows you to adjust the recording level for both channels 1 and 2 simultaneously when you turn the gain control just for channel 1, if linked is selected. However, you can't have one input on mic level and the other on line level if you want to use this function. The next three menus allow you to customize input number 1, and then the next three let you customize the same settings for input number 2. There's a noise reduction function that works when the XLR input switch is on mic. You can trim the input level to compensate for different audio sources that might be a little too strong or a little too quiet. And you can turn on a wind noise reduction filter if you want it. I recommend having this turned on when shooting outdoors with a shotgun microphone mounted on the camera, but be sure to turn it off if you're recording from any other source. That's about it for the audio menu, so I'm going to press the menu button to go back to the regular shooting display. Notice that the audio level meters are displayed on the bottom right corner of the screen. I can tell just by looking at the screen that both of the gain control switches on the side of the camera are set for automatic, because if input number 1 was set for manual, we'd see this icon. Or this if both inputs were on manual. Or this if only input 2 was on manual. These audio level meters are kind of hard to see, so you'll want to press the status check button and go to page 1 whenever you need to adjust the audio levels with any kind of precision. You can toggle this display on and off as needed with the status check button. -20 up to -10 is the range where you want your audio levels to peak. Any higher and you'll risk distortion. Any lower and you may not have a strong enough signal for clean editing. Below the meters you can see the status of all the major audio settings without digging down into the menus. Here I can see that input number 1 is being recorded on both channels 1 and 2. I can change that by sliding the switch over here to this position. And now input number 1 is only feeding channel 1, and input number 2 would be feeding channel 2, but since there's nothing plugged into XLR input number 2, there's no audio being recorded at all on that channel. Let's flip it back to where it was before. Down here we can see that phantom power is being sent to the shotgun microphone. The XLR input is set for mic level. Noise reduction is turned on. The trim has not been customized, and the wind filter is turned on. It's always a good idea to monitor your audio during shooting, and you can plug in your headphones here. Volume for the headphones is controlled with the volume button up front. There's no way to choose which of the two channels you're monitoring in the headphones, and no way to mix both channels to both ears. One channel is in one ear and the other channel is in the other ear, and there's no way to change that. As I mentioned earlier, the Z7 has 8 assign buttons that can be used to provide easy access to frequently used functions. 6 of the assign buttons are located in this area of the camera body. The other 2 assign buttons are located on the Zeiss lens. The buttons on the lens are called L1 and L2. If you're using a lens other than the Zeiss lens that came with the camera, then obviously you won't have the L1 and L2 buttons, but you will be able to program the return button on the other lens if it has one. Assign buttons 4, 5, and 6 come from the factory with pre-programmed functions that are written above them. You can leave them programmed that way, or you can change them to something else. It's entirely up to you what you do with the buttons, but I encourage you to take a few minutes and think about choosing settings that you'll actually use. Let's press the menu button and go to the Others menu, and then select the Assign Button submenu. Now we can choose either to program the camera's 6 assigned buttons or the 2 buttons on the lens. Let's choose the camera. Right away you can see that my camera's assigned buttons are not on the default settings anymore because my camera has already been customized to fit my needs. Any button that hasn't been assigned a function will just have a dashed line next to it. I've purposely left button number 1 unprogrammed so that we can give it an assignment right now. All I have to do is highlight the name, select it, and then choose whatever function I want from the list. There are 28 possible choices, but there are only 8 buttons on the camera, so you have to decide which ones are the most important to you. Probably no 2 people will agree on the same 8 functions or which buttons they assign them to. Fortunately, a lot of the functions are for things that you'll probably never want to use anyway, so that makes it easier to winnow down the list. Let's go through the list and I'll offer some thoughts and suggestions on the various functions, But don't take my opinion as gospel. It's up to you to decide what is useful for you and what isn't. Focus, expanded focus, and one-push autofocus were discussed in the focus chapter. If you'll be using autofocus very often, these are excellent tools to have at your fingertips. However, don't forget that expanded focus won't work if you're shooting with the memory recording unit, so don't waste an assign button on expanded focus if you'll be recording on compact flash cards. Focus infinity will refocus a lens to infinity at the push of a button under certain very limited conditions. For most people, I wouldn't suggest wasting an assign button on this function. By default, focus macro is already turned on in the camera set menus, and there's no reason to ever turn it off, so I'd skip adding this function to an assign button. We talked about digital extender in the zoom chapter, and I don't think you'll ever want to use that. Same thing for hyper gain. It's probably not something you'll want to use very often, if ever. Black balance is so seldom needed that it doesn't make sense to waste an assign button on it. If you ever want to do a black balance, you can go to the camera set menu and do it from there instead. AE Shift allows you to apply an offset value to the automatic exposure. If you use automatic exposure, then this function might be worth using. By default, it's already assigned to button number 5 and labeled as such, so if you're going to use AE Shift very often, leave it assigned to number 5. Index marks can be used to mark certain scenes to make them easier to find during playback. If you have a use for index marks in your workflow, then this might be a good choice for one of the buttons. Steady shot is definitely worth assigning a button to. Just about any time you're shooting handheld, I'd recommend using steady shot because it really works. But for tripod shooting, you don't want it turned on. So even though you can turn steady shot on and off from the camera set menu, using the assign button for instant access will be much more convenient. In my opinion, backlight, spotlight, and fader are consumer-oriented features, so let's just skip those. Color bar can make an excellent choice for one of the buttons. At the head of every new tape, it's good practice to record at least 30 seconds of bars and tone, so if you have color bar assigned to a button, then you won't have to dig down into the camera set menu every time you need to turn bars on or off. Last scene review can be used anytime you want to have the camcorder automatically rewind the tape to the beginning of the most recently recorded scene. Play it back to the end of the scene, stop the tape, and return to standby mode, all automatically. This is a very handy feature if you regularly like to check what you just shot. Record review is a similar function, but instead of playing the entire last scene, it just plays the last 2 seconds. End search can be used to recue the tape to the end of the last recording. This is handy if you've been using the camcorder in playback mode, and now you want to recue the tape so it's ready to start shooting again. Zebra is an important tool for setting exposure, and button number 4 is already programmed for Zebra. I suggest leaving it that way. Marker provides an easy way to show or hide whatever markers you've chosen to display with the Display Set menu. Peaking is an important tool to assist with accurate focusing, and I suggest you give it its own assign button, unless you just want to go into the menus and just leave it turned on 100% of the time. Display will let you toggle on and off the displays shown on the LCD and viewfinder, but you already have a dedicated display button right here, so you'll have to decide whether having another display button is important or not. TC Reset and TC Countup might be useful in some unusual circumstances, but for most people, these will just risk accidentally resetting the timecode when you didn't mean to. And any jumps in timecode can really play havoc when you go to log and batch capture your scenes into your NLE. Photo can be selected to turn one of your assigned buttons into a shutter button for taking photos. Record lamp front and record lamp rear allow you to disable the red tally lights from illuminating while you're recording. I could think of many reasons why you might want to keep these lights turned off, particularly the front one, but is it worth giving it an assign button of its own? I doubt it. You can always go to the Others menu and disable them anytime you want to without wasting an assign button. And finally, you can program an assign button to quickly switch to one of your 6 memorized picture profiles. My favorite choice for assign button number 1 is peaking, so I'm going to scroll back up and select it. So that's an overview of the choices that are available to you, and you've heard my opinion about them. Maybe you agree or disagree, but that's not what's important. The important thing is for you to take a few minutes and choose the ones that will work best for you. Here's what I have chosen for my 6 buttons on the camera body. And here's what I've chosen for L1, L2, and return on the lens. Because one-push autofocus and steady shot only work if the Zeiss lens is on the camera, it makes sense to have them programmed for L1 and L2 rather than one of the buttons on the body of the camera. An easy way to remind yourself what you've programmed the buttons for is to press the status check button and go to page 4 and page 5. An unusual feature found on the Z7 is the ability to take still photographs. Now obviously it's not going to replace your regular digital camera, but I can think of many situations where it'd be handy to snap a photo for immediate emailing to a client, or maybe to keep continuity records during a shoot, or to save an example of a lighting setup for future reference. However, there are a few things to keep in mind. To take photos, you must first assign the photo function to one of the assign buttons. Then that button will work as the shutter release button when you want to take a picture. The recording mode can be either HDV, DV, or DV-Cam, but you must be using an interlaced mode. That means 60i for NTSC or 50i for PAL. The camera will not take still photos if you're shooting with one of the progressive modes. Only JPEG files can be recorded. The maximum resolution is 1.2 megapixels and the JPEG dimensions are 1440 by 810. If the camera is set for DV or DV-Cam shooting, in the 4:3 mode instead of widescreen, the file size will only be 0.9 megapixels with a resolution of 1080 by 810. You can use the photo button even while you're recording video. The minimum shutter speed is 1/60th. If you attempt to take a photo while the shutter speed is set slower than that, you'll get an error message. The photos can only be recorded on a memory stick duo. They cannot be recorded onto a compact flash card in the memory recording unit. And you can still take photos even if there isn't a videotape currently loaded in the camera. So those are the main things to know about taking still photos with the Z7, except for one more feature that I saved for last. The camera can also grab still frames during playback from the tape or from the compact flash card. So if you're playing back footage and you see an image that you want to grab, just press the photo button to capture a JPEG. And there's one more piece of good news. Although the camera won't take photos while you're shooting with any of the progressive modes, it will capture freeze frames later when you play progressive video back. So in other words, if you're shooting your video with 24p or 30p and you really want to grab a still image, stop recording, switch to VCR mode, play the video back, and press the photo button when you see the picture that you want to grab. While you're in VCR mode, you can review your photos to see what you've shot by pressing the play button right here, not the other play button up here. To see other photos, use the volume button to go backwards or forwards. Here we can see we're looking at image number 5 out of 10 that are stored on the memory stick right now. You can switch to a thumbnail view by pressing the index button at any time. The red arrow indicates the currently selected photo, and you can move it by pressing the volume button. To see an image full screen, press the play button again. To erase a photo that you don't want to keep, press the delete button. Select yes, and the photo is gone, so be careful. The Z7 provides a convenient method of storing all your customized camera settings in a computer file. This is useful for transferring camera settings among multiple cameras, or if several people share a camera, they can each memorize and recall their own favorite settings. That's called a camera profile. The Z7 can store 2 camera profiles in its onboard internal memory banks and up to 99 more on a memory stick duo. However, the camera profile data cannot be used with other camcorder models and it cannot be edited on a computer. But you can see the files on a computer. If you slip the memory card into your computer's card reader, you can easily drill down until you see the DAT files stored on the card. Each of these files is a camera profile that can be saved, archived, copied, or even be attached to an email and sent to other camera operators anywhere in the world. So what settings are saved in the camera profile? Well, as far as I can tell, every user customizable setting on the camera is saved, including all of the menu settings and all 6 of the picture profiles. Let's take a closer look by going to the Others menu and choosing the Camera Profile submenu. There are only 5 things you can do from this menu: load a profile, save a profile, rename a profile, delete a profile, and make a copy of a profile. When you choose to load a file, keep in mind that you'll be replacing all of the camera's current settings with the new ones stored in the file. You cannot pick and choose some settings to import and not others, and that includes picture profiles. So consider yourself warned that if you load a camera profile, all of your existing picture profiles will be overwritten. Here we can see that we have 4 choices for loading into the camera. Cam 1 and Cam 2 are the 2 that are stored in the Z7's onboard internal memory. Plus we have 2 more choices I created earlier that are stored on the memory stick. To load one of the profiles, you just select it, answer yes, and then wait a few seconds for the camera to reboot. If you want to save the camera's current settings as a camera profile, choose Save. And then you can decide whether to overwrite one of the 2 internal profiles or save it to the memory stick. If you choose memory stick, then you can overwrite one of the existing files or create a totally new one. Now profile names like Cam 1, Cam 2, MS01, MS02, etc. don't tell us anything meaningful about the profile, so it's a good idea to give them a custom name. Through the magic of editing, I'm going to name this profile Sports1. But notice that the real file name is still called MS01. All we did was add a description. We didn't actually change the file name, so calling this menu Profile Name is a little misleading. So if you wanted to do something like email the DAT file to someone else, you'd be looking for a file called MS01 on the memory stick and not Sports1. If you want to delete a profile, that's simple enough to do. Or if you want to make a copy of a profile so you can modify it without changing the original, that's pretty easy also. The Z7 offers a few functions that I would classify as special effects. One of these is color correction, which we talked about in the Picture Profiles chapter. Another one is called Smooth Slow Recording, which is sort of like slow motion. And while this effect might be good for something like analyzing the motion of a golf swing, please don't make the mistake of thinking this is a good mode to use for situations where maximum picture quality is important. What the camera does is capture images very quickly into a built-in memory buffer for up to 12 seconds, and then it records the video onto the tape or memory card after processing. Here are a few examples. Please keep the following limitations in mind. No audio is recorded, the picture quality is inferior to normal shooting modes, the shutter speed is automatically set to 1/250th, and it only works in the interlaced modes. So, as long as you know about the limitations up front, here's how to set up and use Smooth Slow Recording. First, make sure the camera is set up for an interlaced shooting mode. Then go to the Camera Set menu and choose the Smooth Slow Recording submenu. Now you can choose how long you want the effect to run, 3 seconds, 6 seconds, or 12 seconds. Let's choose 3 seconds. Leave the record timing setting on Start Trigger, and then choose Execute. Now adjust your exposure, focus, and framing as necessary to compose the shot. When you're ready, press the record button and the camera will capture the action for 3 seconds, and then lay the effect to tape. If you want to do another one, you can just press the record button again. To exit this mode, press the menu button once. Since I have assigned button number 6 programmed for Last Scene Review, I can just press it and the Z7 will automatically rewind and play back the clip without making me switch the camera over to VCR mode. Our 3-second piece of action now takes about 12 seconds to play back in slow motion. Another special effect on the Z7 is called interval recording. Normally I'd call it time-lapse, but in this case that would be wrong. The Z7 doesn't offer the smooth flowing one frame at a time recording that you need for high quality time-lapse shooting. What it offers is interval recording for surveillance, weather monitoring, or some other specialized purpose. If you're not sure what I'm talking about, look at this example of time-lapse that was shot with my F350. Notice how the clouds flow by very smoothly and without any jumps. Now look at the best you can do with the Z7. Not quite the same thing, is it? I'll show you why. First, make sure the camera is in an interlaced mode because interval recording doesn't work in progressive. Then go to the camera set menu. Choose the interval record submenu and then choose record time. The shortest record time possible is 0.5 seconds or 15 frames. And that's the main problem right there. In order to create smooth time-lapse recordings with the Z7, you'd have to be able to get this number down to 1 frame, and that's just not possible. Let's select 0.5 seconds anyway and go to the next setting. This one is also a bit of a problem. The shortest interval between captures is 30 seconds, and that's pretty long for creative time-lapse shooting. It might be okay for some purposes, but 5 or 10 seconds is more typical for shooting clouds and fast-moving subjects like that. Finally, let's turn interval recording on and press the menu button. Notice the flashing icon to remind us what mode we're in now. To start the recording, I just press the record button and step away from the camera. With these settings, we'll be capturing 1 second of video every minute. So if we want a 20-second time lapse, we're going to have to wait 20 minutes. Without question, it's great to have the ability to change lenses anytime you want to. This feature of the Z7 and the S270 provides unparalleled flexibility, allowing you to pick the precise type of lens that best suits your subject, shooting style, and budget. There are many reasons why you might want to put a different lens on the Z7, but I don't think that image quality is necessarily one of them, unless you do very high-end work. The stock lens is sharp, fast, and has a decent zoom range on it. For many people, it will suit their needs just fine. But in this chapter, we're going to take a look at some of the other lens alternatives that are out there. The first lens that you might want to consider is the Zeiss wide-angle lens that looks almost exactly like the stock Zeiss lens. Unfortunately, at the time I'm producing this DVD, that lens hasn't been released yet, so I can't show you one and I can't even tell you if I like it. But if you find yourself needing a wide-angle lens, the VCL 308B will certainly be worth considering. However, a drawback that I see with the 308 lens is that it's only 8x. So when you combine the 3.3mm wide-angle focal length and the short 8x zoom range, this is a lens that might not be ideal for all-around shooting. But if you like to use autofocus and/or steady shot, then you should keep the 308 in mind when shopping for a new lens, because only the two Zeiss lenses are likely to offer those features. A nice thing about the Z7 and the S270 are that they have a standard 1/3 inch lens bayonet mount, and there are plenty of lens options available from several manufacturers. Here, I have a 13 by 3.5 wide-angle lens mounted on the camera that Fujinon was kind enough to lend me for this DVD, and I really love it. I've been shooting with it for a few weeks now, and it really makes a difference in the feel of the whole camcorder. Even though the stock Zeiss lens is pretty good, there's just no substitute for having a real honest-to-goodness broadcast lens that feels just like all the other Fujinon lenses I've been shooting with for nearly 30 years. The focus is extremely sharp, and the control you have over zooming is quite a bit better than with the Zeiss lens. If you find yourself having trouble getting smooth starts and stops to your zooms with the Zeiss, then you'd really appreciate the precise control you get from the Fujinon. The main advantage of this lens, however, is that it allows you to get a shot that is about 25% wider than the stock Zeiss lens and still have a 13x zoom range with no loss of light when you're zoomed all the way in. For some people, those benefits alone are enough to justify the cost of upgrading to this lens. To show you the difference in focal lengths, here's a comparison between a wide-angle shot with the Fujinon 13 by 3.5 and the stock 12 by 4.4 Zeiss lens. And here's a comparison between the two lenses zoomed all the way in. Another option on the Z7 and the S270 is to use a lens adapter to mount other sizes of HD lenses to the camera. So if you already own either a 1/2 inch or a 2/3 inch lens, this is an inexpensive way of putting it to work on the Z7. There's even an adapter that you can get to mount any of Sony's digital SLR alpha lenses on the camera. But one thing you need to keep in mind when using these adapters is that you're going to get a focal length increase because they're designed for use with larger size image sensors. If a lens is made for larger sensors than the 1/3 inch CMOS chips inside the Z7, then the angle of view will be smaller than the default focal length of that lens. Here's what I mean. With the 1/2 inch adapter, your apparent focal length will be increased by 1.3x. For the 2/3 inch adapter, your apparent focal length will be increased by 2x. And for the alpha lens adapter, your apparent focal length will be magnified by an amazing 7x. Now, a focal length increase is great if you're going to be shooting wildlife, sports, or other footage where a focal length boost at the telephoto end of the lens will be a big advantage. But it's not so great if shooting with a wide angle lens is important to you. So the bottom line is that these adapters are not so great for wide angle shooting, but they're excellent for telephoto. Here I've mounted a 1/2 inch Fujinon 18 by 5.5 HD lens on the Z7. This is a cost-effective solution for me because I already own this lens and it's what I normally use on my f350 XD-Cam HD camera. But because this lens costs more than twice as much as the Z7 itself, it might not be a very economical choice for you. As I mentioned before, this lens won't be good for wide-angle shooting, but at the telephoto end, I can zoom in 2.5 times closer than with the stock Zeiss lens, and almost 3 times closer than with the 1/3 inch Fujinon 13 by 3.5 lens we saw earlier. Here are a few examples of how the various lenses I have at my disposal stack up against each other. This is the stock 12 by 4.4 Zeiss lens zoomed all the way in and all the way out. Here's the Fujinon 13 by 3.5 lens zoomed all the way out and all the way in. No special adapter is needed for this lens because it has a 1/3 inch mount. Here's the Fujinon 18 by 5.5 lens zoomed all the way in and all the way out. This lens requires the Fujinon ACM19 adapter because it has a 1/2 inch mount. Here's my old Fujinon 15 by 8 lens zoomed all the way out and all the way in. This lens has a 2/3 inch mount, so it requires the Fujinon ACM17 adapter. And here's the same lens with its built-in 2x extender. Yes, the picture is soft and a little jumpy, but for breaking news or surveillance, a lens with this focal length would be great to have. The memory recording unit, or MRU, that comes as a standard accessory with the Z7 and the S270 is a pretty cool device. If you've still been shooting on tape up to this point in your life, the MRU makes a great stepping stone into the world of a tapeless workflow. Except for the occasional use of my Z1, I've been shooting 99% tapeless for about 2.5 years, and I absolutely love it. You couldn't pay me to go back to shooting on tape. Now, there might be plenty of reasons why some people still need to shoot on tape, and you might be in that group, but you should start thinking about moving away from tape as soon as possible. Whether you like it or not, you will be going tapeless sometime in the future. Maybe not this year or next year, but soon, so you might as well get your feet wet now. There are many pros and cons of going tapeless, but here are a few advantages to keep in mind. Every time you press the record button, you are creating a new standalone video clip, just like taking a picture with a digital camera. Ingesting footage from a compact flash card to your hard drive is at least 4 times faster than captured in real time from a tape, and possibly even faster with faster cards. There are no more hassles with broken timecode or batch capture errors. There's no rewinding or fast forwarding. There's no chance of dropouts, edge damage, or other physical problems like you have with tape. You can use a cheap compact flash reader to import footage instead of using the Z7 or an HDV deck for logging and capturing from tape. You'll never spend money buying tape again. Any compact flash card that is at least 2 gigabytes and 133x speed should work just fine, although I recommend using faster and bigger cards. A 16 gigabyte compact flash card holds up to 25% more footage than a small HDV tape, so you get longer record times without stopping. Flash cards are less vulnerable to problems associated with shooting in locations that have temperature extremes, high G-forces, and camcorder vibration. You can go ahead and shoot with the Z7's native progressive modes and not have to worry about compatibility issues with your older playback decks because you don't need a playback deck. Now, as I said earlier in the DVD, the Z7's tapeless workflow is not as sophisticated as XD-Cam, but it's still a lot better than shooting on tape. The MRU mounts directly onto the back of the camera with no need for any extra wires or power source. It gets its power directly from the camera. You can even use the MRU as a standalone external recording unit with a supplied cradle. I recommend that in the beginning with the Z7, you record both on tape and the MRU at the same time. That's really a great thing about the Z7. You can do both until you decide it's time to stop shooting on tape altogether. There are actually several variations of how you can record with compact flash cards and videotape at the same time. 1, you can record HDV on both. 2, you can record HDV on tape but record DV on the card. Or 3, you can record DV on tape and DV on the card at the same time. Notice that you cannot record HDV to the card and SD to the tape. That's the one combination that isn't allowed. So if you want to record HDV for future use, but have a DV copy ready to edit with right now with no extra down conversion steps, option number 2 is a very flexible choice. However, I suggest that you choose option number 1, and that's what we're going to do today. With option number 1, you can save time editing with clips taken from the flash card, but keep the tape on the shelf as a permanent archive, just in case. First, go to the In-Out Record menu. Scroll down to the External Record Control submenu and choose Record Control Mode. There are 3 choices plus off. We want to choose synchronous so the tape and flash card record at the same time. But first, let's talk about the other 2. Relay mode is an interesting choice if you're shooting for long periods of time, such as a classroom or church service, and you don't want to miss anything important while you change tapes. With this mode, the cam will record on tape until it gets close to the end, and then automatically switch over to recording on the memory card before the tape runs out, thus allowing you to change tapes and then switch back to recording on tape to continue. Later, you can splice all the pieces together in post. If you choose external only, then recording on tape is disabled. When the record button is pressed on the camera, only the flash card will start recording. But since we want to record both on tape and cards at the same time, let's choose synchronous and then exit. Now that the camera is ready to go, the MRU needs to be configured. Start by turning the power switch on. I usually leave mine turned on all the time. There's no reason to turn the MRU off because it will turn off automatically all by itself when you turn off the camera. Press the menu button and use the down arrow button to go to Setting. And then press Execute to select it. The Execute button and the Play button are the same button. Press the down arrow button again till you come to Cam Link Select and press the Execute button again. Highlight Synchro and select it. Now push Menu to exit. That's it. The camera and MRU are all set to record the tape and the flash card simultaneously whenever the record button is pressed on the camera. Now, if for some reason you ever decide that you want to record to the flash card only without changing the configuration of the menu settings, you can press the 2 record buttons on the MRU. Or just the opposite. If you ever want to record on tape only, you can press the Cam Link button to make this icon disappear. Whenever this icon is gone, that means the camera will only record to tape when the record button is pressed. You can turn synchro mode back on by pressing the Cam Link button again. To check the status of the MRU, press the status button on the camcorder and go to page 8. You can see the record format, the status of the unit, this icon means it's in standby right now, the time code, the clip number, whether Cam Link is on or off, and how much time is remaining on the compact flash card. You can play back clips on the card by switching the camcorder to VCR mode and then using the controls on the MRU, but it takes some time to get the hang of it. You can jump directly to any previous clip by pressing the menu button and then Clip Select. Now choose a clip number. I'll choose 15. Press Execute, then Menu, and then play. A couple of interesting features of the MRU are cache recording and loop recording. To turn on cache recording, press the menu button, go down to record mode, highlight cache, select it, and then press the menu button. Notice that the cache icon is now visible. With cache turned on, the camera has a 14-second buffer of audio and video that is constantly being updated and temporarily stored in the MRU's memory. Whenever you press the record button, whatever was in the buffer is saved and recorded onto the card. For example, suppose we want to get a shot of a car coming around a bend in the road, but we don't know when the car is coming, and by the time we see it, it will be too late to capture it coming into frame. So we turn on cache, frame up the shot, and wait for the car to come around the bend. As soon as we see it, we very carefully press the record button so as not to jiggle the camera, and whatever was in the buffer is now captured along with everything else the camera continues to shoot until we stop recording. The other feature I want to show you is loop recording. With loop turned on, the camera will record continuously until it reaches the end of the card and then start recording again at the head of the card in a never-ending loop, kind of like the black box data recorder in an airplane that just keeps recording over and over again. So for example, if you're using a 16 gigabyte card and you press stop after the camera has been in the loop mode for a long time, you'll capture up to 75 minutes of whatever audio and video the camera saw. To turn on loop recording, press the menu button, go down to record mode, select it, scroll down until you come to loop, select it, and then press the menu button. Notice that the loop icon is now visible. You have to press the two record buttons to start recording because the cam link mode is disabled now. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about earlier was formatting a card. You should always format cards with the MRU at the beginning of a shoot. Press the menu button, go to delete and select it, scroll down to format and select it, go to OK and execute. And then the formatting proceeds automatically. Press the menu button to finish. Now there are a lot of other functions that the MRU can do, but we've covered the major ones that you really need to know about. Before we wrap up this chapter, let's talk about a few things you need to be aware of with the MRU. Playback from the card isn't clean like tape. There's a bit of a glitch between clips. Expanded focus doesn't work when you're using the MRU. Timecode numbers usually don't match between video that's recorded on the card and on the tape. Once a compact flash card has been erased, the clips that were on it are gone, so you need to have a well thought out plan for archiving your clips. I would suggest a system that includes at least 2 copies of everything. Personally, I put a copy of my clips on a cheap hard drive, and then I burn a second copy to a DVD. Dual-layer DVDs hold 8.5 gigabytes of data, and that matches up very nicely with 8 gigabyte compact flash cards. When I come back from a shoot, every 8 gigabyte card gets burned to a dual-layer DVD just as soon as I can. Another thing you need to know about is that there's really no way of programming the camera to give each of your clips a custom name as they're recorded, like you can do with XDCam. Here's the naming system that the MRU uses. The first 2 digits are the camera number. These are the only 2 digits that you can program manually. We'll take a look at how to do that in a minute. The next 4 digits are the actual clip number, and they count up sequentially every time a new clip is recorded. Next, you've got the year, the month, the day, the hour, the minute, and the second that the clip was recorded. The 3-digit extension will be M2T for HDV clips, or AVI or DV for standard definition clips. To change the camera number that's used in the clip name, press the menu button, go down to Setting, and then go down to Camera Number, and program a new 2-digit number. Let's make this 04. Press Execute, and then Menu. Now that number will be used in the file name until you change it again. Perhaps the biggest thing of all to watch out for with the MRU is what happens when you press stop at the end of recording. You may not notice it at first, but be warned that you will usually lose the last 2 seconds of whatever you thought you had recorded. So be sure to let every shot roll for at least 2 seconds longer than what you think you need. For example, watch this experiment. I'm going to record the stopwatch as it counts up. When the counter reaches 10 seconds, I'm going to press the stop button as quickly as I can. Now this is what was recorded on the tape. We captured the full 10 seconds plus a few extra frames to account for my slow reaction time hitting the stop button. But look what was captured on the compact flash card. It only recorded about 8 seconds. We're missing nearly a full 2 seconds of video. So be very careful that you don't clip off the end of something important. If you're shooting an interview, a classroom, a wedding service, or whatever, make sure to let the camera continue to roll for at least 2 seconds after you think you have what you need. Don't cut it too close. Once you've completed your shoot and you're ready to start editing, your workflow will vary depending on several factors, including whether you have recorded on videotape, compact flash cards, or a combination of both, whether you have shot your video as HDV, DV, or DV cam, whether you have used an interlaced or progressive shooting mode, whether you're using a Mac or a PC, your choice of editing software, and even the version number of the software you're using, whether you'll be editing HD or SD, whether you'll be outputting your final project as HD, SD, either on tape, on DVD, or to the web. There are so many variables that I couldn't begin to cover them all in this workshop, and then they would be outdated as soon as Apple, Avid, Adobe, or Sony releases a new update. Keep in mind that this is a tutorial on the Z7, and once you've ejected that tape or the card from the camera, you're no longer dealing with the camera, you're dealing with your own unique post-production workflow. Now, with that said, let's take a quick look anyway at the unique issues of working with footage that was captured on a compact flash card. If you're editing with Vegas or some of the other NLEs, then you'll be able to copy the M2T files from the compact flash card onto your hard drive and then bring them straight into Vegas without any processing at all. Very simple, just drag and drop. However, if you're editing with Final Cut Pro 6, as I do, then things aren't as simple. Final Cut can't read the native M2T files that the MRU records on the cards, so you need to convert them to QuickTime MOV files while you import them from the card onto your hard drive. Here's how. You can either put the card into an ordinary compact flash card reader or use the MRU in its cradle to connect to the Mac via FireWire. Is there a difference? Yes, at least there is on my computer. The MRU is about 30% faster than a USB reader. Next, launch Final Cut Pro and either open an existing project or start a new one. I'm going to create a new bin and name it Z7 Demo and set it as the logging bin. Now go to the File menu and then choose Log and Transfer. Don't confuse it with Log and Capture. If you don't see an option for Log and Transfer, then you may need to download an updated plugin. This is the browse area up here, and it's where your flash card and the individual clips on it will appear. You can click on a clip's thumbnail to highlight it, but unfortunately, the current version of Final Cut Pro does not support any previewing of HDV clips. If your clip is a DV or DV cam clip, then you can play it back. Hopefully this bug will be fixed soon, and may even be fixed by the time you're watching this DVD. With the default view, about the only information you can see is the name, a thumbnail, the starting timecode number, and the duration. If you want to see more data about the clip, go up here, right-click with your mouse, and choose Show All Columns. Over here you can change the reel name, the clip name, or add any other metadata that you want. To import all of the clips on the card, you can simply drag and drop the card icon into the transfer queue area. Or if you want to be more selective, you can choose individual clips or groups of clips to drag and drop. As soon as a clip is imported, the clip is removed from the queue window and the icon here changes to a solid circle to let you know that it has already been imported. During the import, the M2T suffix is stripped off and replaced with an MOV suffix instead. That's really all that's done to the clip, so the transfer is very fast and does not harm the video at all. When you're done importing, you can close the window and take a look at your logging bin. There are all the clips. Now they are just ordinary QuickTime movies that can be used just like any other clip. The final step is to make at least one archive copy of the clips before you reformat the compact flash card. As I said before, I recommend making a hard drive copy and a DVD copy so you have two backups. Hopefully this workshop has gotten you started on the right track to mastering the HVR-Z7 or the S270. Because no matter how experienced you are, there will always be a learning curve when it comes to understanding any new piece of equipment. And in this case, you're also learning a new recording medium and a whole new way of thinking as you transition to a tapeless workflow. But obviously, there are no universal camera settings that will work for everyone, and you might find that you disagree with some of my recommendations. But that's what makes the Z7 and the S270 so great. You can customize your camera and your workflow to fit your own needs. But one thing I can guarantee you is that if beautiful video is what counts to you and your clients, then you've made a great choice with either of these two cameras. I encourage you to take what you've learned today and go out and shoot some test footage. Experiment, play with the settings, test drive all the features, and make sure you can work smoothly and efficiently with all the camera's controls. In no time at all, you'll be shooting great video. Thanks for watching.